From Software had an amazing 2022. The much anticipated Elden Ring was a massive hit, encapsulating the hearts of millions on their way to winning the Game Awards Game of the Year. This propelled the environmental storytelling genre of Souls-like to unforeseen levels of exposure, and I can't help but cast my mind back to the origin of Souls-like games, Demon Souls, but more predominantly the Dark Souls series. The narrative of Souls-like games have always engrossed my attention, with its story often being told through a vague cloud of mystery, allowing us to draw our own conclusion based upon the glimpses of tales scattered throughout a free-roaming world. The players are thrust into a land riddled with the curse of the undead, with many losing their sanity and turning hollow. The gods attempted to recreate the world, beginning the Age of Fire, but during the events of Dark Souls 1, the first flame is beginning to fade. The chosen undead is able to renew the Age of Fire, or bring about the Age of Dark. In Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse learns about the rise and fall of kingdoms, ones that are struggling to break free from this now cyclical fate of the flame. Come the event of Dark Souls 3, the cycle of the flame has brought powerful lords to ruin, and the Ashen One is finally able to break this cycle. An iceberg chart is a template in which theories and mysteries about a topic can be displayed, with the higher parts of the iceberg containing commonly known theories that are more likely to be true, and as we gaze further down the iceberg, the more peculiar and perplexing the theories become. Throughout our adventures together, we've already gone through icebergs for Dark Souls 1, 2 and 3, but I'm sure like you, I can't help but revisit the alluring world of Dark Souls. So today we'll be covering what I'll call a definitive iceberg of the entire Dark Souls trilogy. We'll not only be enhancing and correcting our previous Dark Souls theories we've talked about before, but also bringing in some new points of discussions from a select few icebergs located around the internet. There's quite a few of them, so all the icebergs I'll be touching will be in the description. And I would like to apologise because there's one rule that we'll be breaking during this video. To try and keep our conversation as fluid as possible, we'll be shuffling the theories around, so the ones that you think may be at the tip of an iceberg may be saved for a later point of discussion further down, but hopefully this allows the theory discussion to flow a bit better. So yes, this will be a massive video. So let's once again depart our bonfire to traverse the ever-growing iceberg of the Dark Souls universe. Basilisks are one of the most frustrating enemies in the Dark Souls universe, appearing in all of the Dark Souls games and Elden Ring. Also known as cursed toads, they can spew a deadly mist that if ingested at large enough quantities, can instantly kill the player. So it's undoubtedly annoying that these enemies are so prevalent through the Dark Souls games. Miyazaki certainly loves to make his games difficult. There's even one very special basilisk which can be found at the Great Hollow, but only if we look closely at our souls. When we first enter the area, we receive 400 souls for seemingly doing nothing. This is the same number of souls that you receive for killing a basilisk, so it was theorised that a basilisk had fallen through the map. Jed Lang looked at the Dark Souls map data and found that there was a basilisk caught outside of the map boundaries, ironically being cursed to die every time we enter the Great Hollow. So if the deadly basilisks are giving you some grief, make sure to enter the Great Hollow and get some nice, safe revenge. But not only are the basilisks deadly, they also look so threatening. Take a look at those massive eyes. But we have yet again been tricked by the basilisks. These are not actually the basilisk's eyes, but rather two bulbous growths, while their actual eyes are two black specks hidden underneath them. So are these massive fake eyes actually for anything other than just pranking the player? Well, animals in the real world like butterflies, frogs, and even birds do utilise these fake eyes, which they use to intimidate would-be predators and prey. So the basilisk could also be using this to intimidate us, who I guess could be both their prey and predator. But I think there's a more mythological explanation for this. Basilisks were prominent in European mythology. One of the earlier records of basilisk is in Pliny the Elder's Natural History, where he describes the basilisk destroying all shrubs that it is breathed upon, and would even break stone. So tremendous was its noxious influence. The myths grew to levels where the reptiles would even cause death to those who looked into its eyes. In Dark Souls 1, Basilisk can drop the Eye of Death, spreading disaster across neighbouring worlds, leading to further proliferation of Bane. Maybe like Wisto87 suggests, the Basilisk's fake eyes could actually be housed in the toxic gases, essentially being the Eyes of Death. This is not that likely, as a variant of Basilisks in Dark Souls 2 no longer have massive fake eyes, yet can still breathe out their toxic gas. Perhaps these eyes just symbolise the imminent death approaching through a cloud of mist. Cementing Basilisk in mythological history would help explain why we see Basilisk also in Elden Ring. Although it's pretty much just fan service for all of us Dark Souls fans, Elden Ring is heavily inspired by mythology, so the legendary Basilisk fits in well. But it's not just the enemies in Dark Souls that can strike fear into the player. Like many horror games, where music sets the tone and builds suspense for the listener, Dark Souls masterfully crafts its ambient music. Curse jars giggle throughout the shaded ruin, and pretty much wherever you are in the Souls universe. If you stop and listen to your surroundings, you can start to hear even more chilling sounds. The creepy inhale of the protagonist's breath can be heard. Footsteps without an owner reverberate around the room. And if you're in locations like the Duke's Archive, many whispers begin to emerge. Demon's Lantern managed to extract all of the audio files from Dark Souls, and when the Duke's Archive ambience is examined, clear intentional whispers can be heard. So what really are these whispers? The Duke's Archives is a massive library imprisoned, named after the dukedom that was awarded to Seath the Scaleless. Seath used this gifted archive to continue his research into his consuming desire to achieve immortality, as unlike the other immortal dragons, he didn't have any scales. Through the primordial crystal, Seath managed to obtain immortality, but at a cost. Seath lost his mind, and he became mad. Locking himself in his archive, he sent his channelers to collect human specimens, the Maidens, imprisoning them in a giant cell. Some think that the Pasaka, deformed mistakes that roam the Duke's archives, are these Maidens, or at least ones that have had horrible experiments performed upon them. 2 weeping Pasakas drop the miracle Bountiful Sunlight, a special miracle that's granted to the Maidens of Guinevere, Princess of the Sun. In a similar vein, many theorise that these whispers spread through the Duke's archives are also that of the Maidens, perhaps urging retribution. But what makes this theory a bit more complicated is that of very similar whispering that can be heard in Dark Souls 2. Because of this, the whispering by the imprisoned maidens does seem less likely, as while there are maidens in Dran Lake, they haven't endured the same struggles that one of the Duke's archives have. There are some other theories for the source of these whispers though. Spectrum 124936 supposes that these whispers are just a byproduct of nearby forbidden knowledge. In Bloodborne, when you consume the madman's knowledge, a faint whispering also occurs. Even if it drives one mad, it allows one to serve a grander purpose. This can draw parallels with Dark Souls. The Duke's Archives is a place full of knowledge, with the combined whispering being stronger and louder. This could have been too much for Seath, the consumer of this knowledge, who slowly became mad. Places like the Majula Mansion basement, where we also hear whispering in Dark Souls 2, could also loosely be connected with knowledge, as it contains the Dran Lake map. But the relationship to this isn't quite as strong. Squidheim tries to link these whispers more directly to Dark Souls 2, and they believe that the whispers have a direct correlation to souls. Seath does many experiments, like creating the Moonlight Butterfly soul, so perhaps these soul fragments are trying to communicate. In Dark Souls 2, Emerald Herald, who fulfills the role of a firekeeper, introduces Vendrick, the great king of Dran Lake.
Go on and see the king, he who made Dran Lake what it once was, he who peered at the essence of the soul. King Vendrick.
Not only does Vendrick peer into souls, he has also experimented with them, creating golems, statues that are powered by souls. These have also been sprinkled across Dran Lake, so perhaps these misused souls are also the source of the whispers. As for the footsteps that we hear around Dark Souls, we can also source these to ambient tracks extracted by Demon's Lantern. the tranquil scenery of Analondo is actually hiding in the background the echoing of footsteps and the opening of doors. These have purposely been included without an owner. So what could these fabled ghost footsteps represent? Some suggest that these are the footsteps of players who have died in the area, with their ghosts doomed to repeat their fabled steps, echoing throughout time. While others suggest that these footsteps are due to the timeline in Dark Souls being distorted, with these footsteps actually being from the past. In a similar vein, the whispers would also be from the past, in a time when Lordran was full of people. Alternatively, it could be a subtle mentioning to the illusions that Gwendolyn made in Analondo. Although Dark Souls 2 doesn't have any ghost footsteps, it does have another ghost-like creature, Invisible Hollows. Found sitting in a state of despair, these enemies can only be seen with a light source, and actually never attack you. They can also be found using the Ring of Whispers, which allows you to hear their inner voices when close. These enemies are very secretive, and drop very lucrative loot. But what else can we find out about these Invisible Hollows? What's the story behind these ejected creatures? One quite loose theory suggests that Invisible Hollows are simply the next stage of hollowing. After a hollow has been alive for a long time, they could simply slump into a corner, sitting still, and ultimately becoming invisible. Many things are fading away in Drangleic, but for hollowing to be the process of turning invisible is a leap bit too far for me. It seems more likely that the latter stages of hollowing is to change into a tree, rather than invisibility, and we'll get into that later in this video. And by that I mean much later, so here's the timestamp if you want to skip to that. Renoth suggests that these invisible hollows could be created by Uldir, the Scholar of the First Sin, with his experiments going wrong. The Spitfire Spear states that the mysterious Lord Uldir secluded himself inside a manor to conduct various experiments. Those invited to the manor disappeared. Perhaps these disappearing experiments literally did disappear, and became the Invisible Hollows. There are 2 Invisible Hollows found at Uldir's Keep, potentially as evidence from Uldir's experiments. But there are 30 Invisible Hollows that are located around Drangleic. But as Trevolk L2311 points out, the Spitfire Spear is actually referencing, like its description later describes, the malformed beast that roams its halls, not directly the Invisible Hollows. And also, most Invisible Hollows are actually found in the Undead Crypt, a place for the undead who have died to rest in peace. Uldir does appear at the Undead Crypt entrance, so one could argue that perhaps he is discarding his broken experiments throughout Drangleic. But this seems less and less likely. Another item that could reason for why the Invisible Hollows came about is the Hidden Body Sorcery. Found in Dark Souls, this ancient sorcery of the lost land of Ulasil turns the body nearly invisible. Although perfect invisibility is unachievable due to the risk of dissipation, the caster need only stand still for a moment to blend into the environment with astounding camouflage. These hollows do remain motionless, so perhaps they've been inflicted with some level of hidden body sorcery themselves. But this seems more likely a curse rather than a blessing, with the invisible hollows only able to just exist, hoping that one day the bearer of the curse can discover them, and finally end their suffering. Now let's descend from the sky towards the Archdragon Peak of Lothric. And what better place to start off this section of the Iceberg than its namesake, Archdragon Peak. A shrine to worship the ancient dragons, the Archdragon Peak is a dilapidated structure of beauty. Part of this man-made structure includes a stone, right next to the first bonfire, having been covered with Arabic inscriptions, with a hollow resting against the stone. Yondame 008 spent time deciphering these inscriptions, but the text seems quite random and starkly juxtaposed to Dark Souls lore, with Cell 91 relating it to an Egyptian article. This article details the anger of the Minister of Transport at the delay in development of the Egyptian Railway Hospital. That article feels a bit out of place in the Dark Souls universe. Maybe it's just implying that the Archdragon Peak is in the Middle East, many years into the future, after human civilization had fallen. As Noised4321 points out, the Archdragon Peak drew architectural inspiration from the Byzantine Empire, so the text here is most likely just to add to the overall historic feeling that the Archdragon Peak provides. The Archdragon Peak isn't actually the only location with strange textures throughout Dark Souls, but Dark Souls 2 is the greatest offender in this regard. venturing to the dark and ominous place of the gutter, many structures and items long abandoned can be found. It seems even the designers might have even abandoned this area. On one of the pillars, a car tyre can be found, with some other suspiciously out of place looking trash. Moonlight Ruin managed to source this wheel to some sort of chariot model that ended up being cut before the release of Dark Souls 2. Although this is not where the strange textures in Drangleic stop. A Heineken bottle label can be found at the Grave of Saints, while tyre tracks can also be found. Hang on, let's put our tinfoil hats on. A tyre track and a tyre in Drangleic? This has to be intentional. Drunk drivers confirmed in Dark Souls. Not really, I'd say it's just source images of trash that haven't been properly vetted for items that shouldn't appear in the Dark Souls universe. A strange texture on a rock isn't the only interesting point of discussion in the Archdragon Peak. And it's not even the only interesting rock in Archdragon Peak. Found watching over the corpse of the Wyvern, the Havel Knight is an enemy that looks oddly familiar. Archbishop Havel the Rock was a close friend of Gwyn, Lord of Cinder. Along with his warriors, he wore armour carved from solid rock, using a hammer carved from an everlasting dragon tooth. In Dark Souls, Havel the Rock can be found hollowed and locked in the Watchtower basement. But there's constant debate as to whether this is really Havel. This Havel Knight drops a Havel ring, which states that it's only worn by Havel's men, to express their faith in their leader and to carry a heavier load. The description states that Havel's followers wore these rings, with perhaps the assumption being that Havel didn't need to wear this ring as he was already strong enough. The Watchtower basement key states that there are rumours of a hero turned hollow who was locked away by a dear friend. For his own good, of course. This implies that it was someone as heroic as Havel that would have been locked up here. But this description does only state that this was a rumour. But why would Havel be locked up in the first place? Havel's miracle, Great Magic Barrier, states that Havel was the sworn enemy of Seath the Scaleless. He despised magic, and made certain to devise means of counteraction. Gwyn did make Seath Duke, so it would be an interesting dynamic to have two individuals so close to you despise each other so much. Maybe Gwyn was the dear friend that locked Havel up. In Analondo, a Havel's knight's set of armour can be found hidden in a room, next to a mimic containing an occult club. The Dark Ember states that the occult weapons were used to hunt the gods, and are effective against their following and kin. So perhaps Havel was planning on a coup of some sort, and if he was, maybe he faked his own imprisonment, being that friend that locked one of his own followers up to pretend to be Havel, initiating the rumour himself. It is possible that Havel went to go confront his arch-nemesis Seath with a primordial crystal, empowering Seath to defeat Havel. A great hero's soul can be found in Seath's boss room, and this is only one of two souls that can be found in Lordran. So could this important soul be Havel? Well, there's not much other evidence to suggest the importance that a great hero's soul provides. And like how the occult club was linked with Havel armour, surely the great hero's soul would also be linked in some way. But this is not where the Havel theory is finished. There's even one more absurd theory that suggests that Havel is the stone dragon. Miss Strallo supposes that Havel was not the knight in the Watchtower, but actually ventured to the Ash Lake and changed his stone armour, transforming into the stone dragon that can be found there. The Great Magic Barrier is found in the Ash Lake along the way to the stone dragon, so this is perhaps very subtly linking Havel to the Ash Lake. Dragons like Seath and Calamite are resistant to magic, so perhaps Havel was enticed with the idea of him himself being resistant to something he despised of. Miyazaki said in an interview that the stone dragon is not alive. The ancient dragons are half living, half element, so that there's no pain for them. So the stone dragon could essentially be half living Havel combined with half stone. Concept art displays that Havel's dragon tooth was originally meant to be an ancient dragon's horn. The stone dragon is also missing a horn. I wonder where this missing horn could be. Mistrallo also links the stone dragon to the Shrine of Amana in Dark Souls 2. Many Archdrake pilgrims can be found, annoying the bearer of the curse. Mistrallo claims that the Shrine of Amana looks quite similar to the Ash Lake, and the Slumbering Dragon shield states that fools woke the Slumbering Dragon. This could loosely link dragons to the Shrine of Amana. However, these are really loose connections. Both the dragons and the areas look very different to one another. So does the base theory of Havel being the stone dragon have any merit by itself? I don't think he would go that far in self-sacrifice against his own morals to try and defeat Seath. Frickin' Chicken supposes that because of the placement of the occult club, Havel was planning upon killing Gwyn, as his plans with Seath had gone too far, but was stopped by his guardian, Smough and Ornstein, smashed to pieces in the history books. There isn't any evidence to support this is really how Havel died, so Stormtrooper 412 furthers this theory nicely, that Havel was actually planning on killing Lord Gwyn's firstborn, but Havel had a change of heart, abandoning Gwyn and joining the firstborn, making peace with the dragons. This could be why we see the Havel Knight at the Archdragon Peak, having been with the Nameless King and the dragons they had befriended. The Ring of the Sun's Firstborn, found in Dark Souls 3, states that the Sun's Firstborn was once a god of war, but was stripped of his stature as punishment for his foolishness. His very name has slipped from the annals of history. This story alludes that Gwyn's firstborn is actually the Nameless King. But do we actually know what the Nameless King's name could have actually been? The Nameless King was once the god of war, slayer of dragons, until he sacrificed everything to become allies with the ancient dragons. His name has slipped from the annals of history, thus becoming the Nameless King. PocketLint60 supposes that the Nameless King is actually Faram. The Faram set in Dark Souls 2 and 3 is named after and blessed by the war god Faram. This set was designed in the style of the Lion Knights. What's also interesting is the engraving of the Faram helm, which depicts a dragon and a knight fighting, perhaps slaying the dragon, like what the Nameless King used to do. An item also found in Dark Souls 3 that could be related to the Nameless King is the war god wooden shield. Featured on the shield was a bizarre pattern, the marking of a mad god, revered as the god of war in remote regions. In Dark Souls 2, this same shield is known as the Lion-clad Shield, which was said to have some sort of religious significance, but we will never know what sort of gods these warriors answer to. But these lion-clad warriors, perhaps lion knights, could have answered to the god of war, who went by Faram. But Faram could just be the title that the Foresters, the land of the Lion Knights, gave to the king, with the Nameless King's name still lost, wiped from the history books. Another theory is that the Nameless King is actually Sen, a large stone fort built as a proving ground for those to enter Analondo. Sen's fortress is full of pitfalls and traps. But why in fact is it called Sen's fortress? Sen in Japanese means 1,000, so there's a murmur of a theory that Sen's fortress is actually a mistranslation of the Japanese name, with a more literal translation being House of 1,000 Traps. But in the Japanese version, the name translates to Sen's Old Castle, with Sen being a proper noun, not a number. So who in fact is Sen? One theory is that Sen is the Crystal Knight, found in the Duke's archives. The Crystal Knight is mentioned minimally throughout the game, but it's not the dialogue that intrigues us here in this theory. The patterns in the Knight's crystalline set are very distinctive. These designs are very similar to ones on Avalon, a triple-bolted crossbow, which was created by the weapon craftsman Edis. This trait of multiple bolts being shot out at once is only found in one other place, Sen's Fortress. AGR Cactus also points out the banister designs in the Duke's archives also share a very similar pattern. So Edis could have been the architect of Sen's Fortress, meaning that it could have been Edis' fortress, with Edis meaning Sen. But it doesn't really stand to reason why Edis would have changed their name to Sen. Andre mentions that
Sen's fortress is an old proving grounds built by the ancient gods.
So maybe the creator of the fortress was not the craftsman Edis. Maybe Sen was an almighty and powerful individual, a god. But unlike other powerful individuals in Dark Souls, Sen is never mentioned anywhere else other than this one fortress. It seems that only a handful of characters, Frampton and Andre of Astora, actually know the fortress by name, so perhaps the fortress's name is also being forgotten, attempting to be removed from history. Found in Sen's fortress are many Silver Knight statues, with no real explanation as to why they were there. It's thought that these statues could be used in Sen's fortress as a training ground for the knights, having been trained by the Nameless King. So perhaps Sen's fortress is indeed the Nameless King's fortress, meaning that the Nameless King is Sen. The mimic found in Sen's fortress drops a lightning spear, which would yet again be a subtle nod to the Nameless King, with the god of war who inherited the sunlight of Lord Gwyn using the Great Lightning Spear. Another interesting occurrence spotted by Bongosaurus Witch is the location of Ricard's rapier, which can be found in both Sen's Fortress and Archdragon's Peak. This seemingly strengthens the links between Sen's Fortress and the Nameless King's Archdragon's Peak. This wasn't originally intended, but it seems like this iceberg layer we have just been talking about theories surrounding the Archdragon Peak. So let's continue that trend and talk about one more strange aspect of the Archdragon Peak, and that's its sky. To first reach Archdragon Peak, the Ashen One needs to perform the Path of the Dragon gesture on a rug in the Irithyll dungeon. The dreary dark sky that clouds the lands of Lothric had been replaced with the glaring sun of Archdragon Peak. Such a strong juxtaposition of weather has to have a meaning, right? The answer to this might be hidden in another area of Lothric that seems to have a sort of mysterious underlying connection to the Archdragon Peak, and that's the Untended Graves. King Osiris was once a mighty king of Lothric, but became obsessed with harnessing his blood for a higher purpose, becoming fascinated by dragons and ultimately becoming consumed by this obsession. In a similar vein, his garden, known as the Consumed King Gardens, has become a relic of his endeavours, both harbouring the pitiful king and slowly being consumed itself by nature. But the Consumed King's Garden is also holding many secrets discoverable by the Ashen One. Behind an alluring chest is an illusory wall, which opens up to a faintly familiar place. Known as the Untended Graves, a mysterious and dark area hint at being an ominous twin to the more comfortable Firelink. But it's also in this very same garden that we can find the Path of the Dragon gesture, used to reach Archdragon Peak. Champion Gundyr notices that the corridor of Aceros hides behind its crumbling walls portions of a darkened sky, a similar darkness to the Untended Graves. Like how the Archdragon Peak is stuck in the sun, the Untended Graves is stuck in the dark. Also found in this same corridor are serpent men, said to have fallen far from grace of their ancient dragon ancestors. These enemies can also be found in Archdragon Peak. Could these places be somehow linked? It seems that both the Archdragon Peak and the Untended Graves seem to be disjointed from their regular cycle of Lothric. Champion Gundyr supposes that there's a deep time-related connection between the two, suggesting that the eclipsed version of Firelink could also be applied to the peak that we see in the Irithyll dungeon, versus the peak the Ashen One is transported to. Well, we don't know for certain that these two observed peaks are actually in fact the same. When travelling to the Archdragon Peak, we first meditate and we don't actually observe our departure, or arrival. So perhaps this Archdragon Peak is something more than meets the eye. To help uncover this mystery, let's first talk about another theory, primarily focused on the Untended Graves, and that's that it's set in the past. This was a theory heavily researched by Nathan, who went through a detailed exploration of the graves, comparing the Untended Graves with the quite similar cemetery of Ash. Firstly, the grave the Ashen One rose from at the start of the game now has a body resting in it, and there also now seems to be grave wardens guarding the cemetery. Opening into a battleground and an imminent boss, we face Champion Gundyr, a champion who had come late to the festivities, and was greeted by a shrine without fire, and a bell that would not toll. Champion Gundyr emits strong parallels to Eudix Gundyr, looking quite similar. Champion Gundyr's armour set states that the belated Champion Gundyr was bested by an unknown warrior. He then became sheathed to a coiled sword, in the hopes that someday the first flame would be linked once more. Curiously, Eudix Gundyr is found immobile, removing a coiled sword from his chest to fight the Ashen One. So could the unknown warrior actually be the Ashen One, defeating the belated Champion Gundyr, causing him to become sheathed to a coiled sword, until the Ashen One arrives once again into the Cemetery of Ash to link the first flame? It definitely does sound possible. Elam3654 believes that the Untended Graves is indeed in the past. Eudix in Latin means to judge, to be the juror. So Eudix and Champion could effectively be titles given to Gundyr. When Champion Gundyr is faced in the past, he could have surprised all his rivals, until the Ashen One arrives and bests him, where his title then changes to Eudix Gundyr. one who now judges all that dare to challenge him, passing his judgment upon those individuals to see if they are worthy of linking the first flame. Another curious circumstance is that of the Shrine Handmaid, who can be found at both the Untended Graves and the Firelink Shrine. She also has a very seclusive piece of dialogue that can only be triggered if the first time we talk to her is at the Untended Graves. If we then go and talk to her later at the Firelink Shrine, she says,
"Oh, thou art... Oh no, it isn't anything, Ashen One."
This alludes that the Shrine Handmaid has recognised us from the original encounter at the Untended Graves, perhaps a time long ago in her past. The Shrine Handmaid also sells the rare Hidden Blessing, which can only be found in a few other circumstances, one of them being in the Untended Graves. It's possible that the Shrine Handmaid found this in the past, to sell at the Firelink in the future. So if we cast our mind back to the Untended Graves and the Archdragon Peak comparisons, Bubianis further relates these two locations to loosely suggest that the Archdragon Peak is also a figment of the past. The main point of this theory is yet again surrounding the sky, with the bright blue sky and sun never relating to any of the skies we see in the land of Lothric. So the Archdragon Peak definitely feels out of place. But valiantly raised by Nodus Casorius, there are in fact similar symbols in the Archdragon Peak and the Lothric Castle, which does suggest that Lothric and the Archdragon Peak are indeed connected. The Lightning Urn's description says that the Knights of Lothric were once hunters of dragons, but then have since tamed them. It's entirely probable that these knights tamed the dragon at their populace of the Archdragon Peak. And the Archdragon Peak is also left in quite a dilapidated state, so if it was a time in the past, it would have still had to have been recent, because it would have had to have been after a lot of the recorded events in the Dark Souls 3 items had occurred. But having these areas in some sort of time capsule does seem far-fetched. When the Ashen One is transported to the Archdragon Peak, even though we cannot see where we move to, we do hear a sound. Similar to other Dark Souls games, this could be the sound of the Wyvern, or another creature that has transported you to the Archdragon Peak. So if this is the present, then what's the deal with this all-present glaring sun? One theory is that if the Nameless King was indeed Lord Gwyn's firstborn, then he could have performed an illusion in the Archdragon Peak, similar to the illusions that Lord Gwyn's last-born, Gwyndolin, performs to create the sun in Analondo. When Gwyndolин's illusion upon Analondo is dispersed, not only do many enemies disappear, but so does the sun, plunging Analondo into darkness. So perhaps the dreamlike state that Archdragon Peak appears in is due to the illusion that is being held under. Well, if this was indeed true, and the Archdragon Peak was under an illusion created by the Nameless King, when the Nameless King is defeated, we'd expect the sky to darken like what happens in Analondo, but it still remains, as blue as ever. And if we were to still refute that the Archdragon Peak is in the past, the many connections to the Archdragon Peak from the Untended Graves could be explained away as Osiris' consuming quest for the dragon powers, becoming a dragon-type mutant, and carrying a ring made from dragon scale. So of course the Archdragon Peak, the place of many dragons, would bear similarities with a place harbouring a man obsessed with them. So what does this make the Untended Graves then? Is it indeed the Firelink Shrine from the past? Another theory suggests that the Untended Graves is actually the real Firelink Shrine, similar to the illusions in Analondo, and our proposed illusions in the Archdragon Peak. The Firelink Shrine that you can seemingly only warp to could just be an illusion, masking the real world of darkness where the fire is nearly completely faded. We can indeed walk to the Untended Graves through the King's consumed garden, but we actually can't walk to the Firelink Shrine. However, when Grirat of the Undead first encounters the Ashen of the One at the High Wall of Lothric, he states he heard a bell from the Firelink Shrine.
And judging by the bell, you must be some of that unkindled ash.
So Firelink is at least in the same realm as some of Lothric. Another theory is that the Untended Graves is actually the Firelink Shrine, but in the future, or at least a vision of a potential future where the flame hasn't been linked. Udisk was indeed impaled by a coiled sword, but it doesn't necessarily have to be by the Ashen One. When Udisk dies, he doesn't drop a soul, so perhaps he didn't die, but was just freed from the corruption of the pus of man. This freeing could have taken some time, and then when he returned, the flame in the shrine was already extinguished. In the untended graves, we can also find a fragment of the coiled sword, which description states that it served its purpose long ago. Could this be the fragment of the same sword used to light the Firelink bonfire many years in the future? Well, not necessarily. It could have been a previous cycle before the events of Dark Souls 3. As for the lack of Udisk not having a soul, this could equally be argued due to the Ashen One already taking Gundir's soul back when he was the belated champion. I think it's most likely that if the untended graves representing the Firelink Shrine, it will be that of the past. A pair of dark eyes, the eyes of a firekeeper, can be found in the untended gardens. They are said to be the eyes of the first firekeeper, and the light that was lost by all firekeepers to come. When this item is shown to Ludleth of Corland, he remarks,
Ah, found her, did we? And the black eyes that shimmer within I see. 'Tis as if it were but yesterday. We did all we could to spare her from them. Much has happened since.
Is Ludleth subtly mentioning that the eyes of a firekeeper, along with their resting place, the untended graves, are from a long time ago, where much has happened since? Oh, that's the bell, which means it's time for us to venture into the Belfry layer of the Iceberg. But have you noticed that we've been followed throughout this iceberg? Like in Drangleic, it seems that we are being watched. But watched by whom? Well, one of the largest culprits of stalking the bearer of the curse is the Pursuer. The Pursuer is quite a mysterious character, who roams Drangleic, relentlessly hunting the dead. Even if defeated, the Pursuer's resolve does not wane, and faces the bearer of the curse again and again, inspired to banish the protagonist of Dark Souls 2. The soul of the Pursuer states that the Pursuer, who seeks the bearer of the sign, will not rest until his target is slain. The Pursuer's Ultra Greatsword furthers this by stating that the Pursuer hunts down those branded by the curse, as if each undead soul that he claims will atone one of his sins. But what kind of sins could the Pursuer possibly have, such that the murdering of countless undead would be needed as atonement? HK Rambo supposes that the Pursuer could actually be the chosen undead from Dark Souls 1. Perhaps after the conclusion of Dark Souls, the chosen undead themselves finally became hollow, only remembering the hunt for the undead, continuing that task constantly. Or maybe the chosen undead brought about the Age of Dark, and is intent on hunting other undead who are trying to link the flame. A combination of these could be a summing of the sins that the Pursuer, the chosen undead, is attempting to redeem themselves from. But there's actually no evidence to suggest that the Pursuer following the player is actually the same character each interaction, and one encounter does in fact heavily discredit a single Pursuer. When you are in a New Game Plus save of the game, two Pursuers spawn at the Drangleic Castle to attack the player. This fight suggests that the Pursuer is actually a profession, rather than just a single character. Vati Video has a video on Discovery's founded translation in Dark Souls 2, where he explains that the Pursuer's translations are quite heavily mistranslated. The Pursuer's soul in Japanese is known as the Cursed One's soul, where the Cursed One is implied to have been one of a group. So it does seem like the Pursuers are intended to be multiple individuals, so it's less likely that they are the chosen undead. The Pursuer's Japanese name, Jubuksa, means curse bound, so rather than pursuing the player, it seems like these knights might be compelled, forced to hunt down those branded by the curse. Dark Souls 2 artist Kota Tanaki states that cursed spirits permeate the Pursuer's entire being cursed armour. Dark Souls lore enthusiast Loki also states that the designer described the spirits as swirling embodiments of malice squirming beneath the armour, trying to burst out of it, with their armour collecting an amassment of grudges. But I personally couldn't find a particular primary source for this statement. However, with this, Loki proposes that the curse-bound knights are relentlessly hunting undead, who have been pursued due to having the curse, with their deaths cursing the knights in order to give the death they inflicted, and curse, purpose. The bearer of the curse isn't actually the only individual followed in Dark Souls. There's another that we can find in Lordran with the Chaser. a scholar of the soul arts who used to be a royal member of the Dragon School. Big Hat Logan roams the lands of Lordran on a never-ending quest for knowledge, but often finds himself imprisoned for his actions.
This place is melting my mind. The inactivity is repressive.
Interesting side fact here, the average-sized Hat Logan researched the meaning behind Big Hat Logan's name, and the name Logan is actually Scottish Gaelic, meaning Little Hollow. So Big Hat Logan could mean Big Hat, Little Hollow. Maybe it's the allure of his massive hat. But Logan has also seemed to gain a fan, someone who seems to be obsessed with him, following him through the game continuously. Griggs of Vinheim is a character that is originally found locked up in a room in the Undead Burg. He's been searching for his master Logan, and once released, can be seen religiously following Logan throughout the game continuously, almost to a level of suspicion. When Griggs is confronted about his obsession with Logan, he justifies it by saying,
"No, the reason I seek Logan is, well, it's really my own conceit now, isn't it?"
Seeking Logan is his own conceit. What does that really mean? This could mean multiple things. Conceit can mean having excessive pride in oneself, like vanity. Eric Van Landslayer of these, 5234, states that Griggs could be prideful of his own abilities as a spellcaster, and this conceit spurs him to further his sorcery through Master Logan. But conceit could also mean a fanciful metaphor, an imaginary concept constructed to support a story. Like FTZPLTC suggests, Griggs could be alluding that him searching for Logan is his fantastical cover story. This propels the theory that Griggs is actually a spy, sent to keep tabs on, or even kill Logan. When you initially save Griggs, he states that he has an important task at hand, which is an odd way to put an adventure to find your mentor. Griggs wears a black sorcerer's set, which says that it's worn by the secret sorcerers at Vinheim Dragon School. They secretly work with sound-based spells, and never reveal themselves. Griggs also secretly wears a slumbering dragon crest ring, which states that it's secretly worn by a surreptitious sorcerer at Vinheim Dragon School. It masks all sound emitting from its wearer. So the Vinheim sorcerers seem to have a lot of secrecy around them. Perhaps this is to hide some sinister underlyings. When we also first find Griggs, in the very same room, there is another sorcerer, stuffed into a barrel, dead. Why is Griggs, also a sorcerer, not condemned to the same fate as this sorcerer? Perhaps the real reason as to why Griggs is so determined to follow his Logan through such dangerous areas such as Sense Fortress is not to learn from his teachings, but to silence Logan before he reveals sorcery information to those outside of the school. Or maybe, like Master of Auarch 6664 suggests, Griggs is just there to keep an eye on Logan's progress. Perhaps updating the Vinheim Dragon School of any new findings. The Vinheim Dragon School specialises in sorcery, with Griggs' sorcery Hush stating that it's no wonder that the town, which is controlled by the Dragon School, has its share of dark secrets. Other than Griggs, Rickett, a blacksmith found in New Londo, is also from Vinheim, but he doesn't reveal too much about their past. However, if we travel to the Road of Sacrifices in Dark Souls 3, there's another sorcerer from Vinheim, Orbeck.
In Vinheim, I was an assassin, a sorcerer only in name, a killer for hire.
So Vinheim produced a blacksmith and an assassin. It isn't that much of a stretch to assume that Griggs could also be an assassin or a spy. But when Orbeck is given Logan's scroll, he reveals a little about Vinheim's love for the Big Hat.
Oh my. You've made quite the discovery. This is a scroll of the prodigious Big Hat Logan, a masterful sorcerer, long missed in Vinheim. And now we have his scroll, right here in my very hands.
Logan was well loved in Vinheim, and armed with this knowledge, it would be safer to assume that Griggs is truly infatuated with Logan, adorned with his beautiful hat, and equipped with deep wisdom and knowledge. But maybe Griggs was a jealous type, wanting to become the best sorcerer at any cost. What do you think is the true motive behind Griggs' constant pursuit of Logan? While a more sinister option is definitely a possibility, I feel like the more face value Griggs that over-idolises Logan is the most possible, with the tremors of Vinheim's dark secrets beating to a different tune. The town of Vinheim isn't the only place in Dark Souls affiliated with sorcery. Ulasil, a land that was reduced to ashes long ago, is the home of ancient sorcery. Using the broken pendant, the chosen undead can travel to the past and see Ulasil on the brink of being consumed by the Abyss, a realm of dark created by Manus. Slowly absorbing everything in its path, Knight Artorias came to stop Manus, but he too was corrupted by the Abyss, sacrificing himself in order to protect the young wolf Sif, using the cleansing Great Shield. Come the time the chosen undead visits Ulasil, the corrupted Artorias is found at Ulasil Colosseum and confronts the chosen undead. Artorias only faces you with his Abyss Great Sword, which does make sense as his shield is still protecting Sif, but his left arm appears limp, unable to help in combat. Many people believe that this is actually Artorias' dominant arm, so imagine how strong he would have been if his left hand was still working. Artorias was first seen in the Artorias of the Abyss expansion of Dark Souls, so when Dark Souls was originally released, many thought that the cover art was depicting Artorias, as the sword and shield on the cover resembled his. This cover art has the wearer holding their sword with their left hand and the shield with the right, so many assumed that Artorias would be left-handed, with this rumour only being strengthened once Artorias' left arm was lame. Dark Souls 2 variant of the Abyss Greatsword, the Majestic Greatsword, states that uncannily, every last one of the prominent swordsmen who inherited this weapon was left-handed. And when this sword is wielded with the left hand, the moveset of the Majestic Greatsword changes entirely, with the moves closer to mirroring those of Artorias. But in Dark Souls 3, their variant of the sword, the Wolf's Knight Greatsword, has removed all left-handed favouritism, with its description also no longer mentioning the left hand. And if we were to be pedantic, the Majestic Greatsword does state everyone was left-handed who inherited the sword, so the original owner Artorias may not have been left-handed. Silver Mont delved deep into the cover art of Dark Souls to see if it was really Artorias on the cover. The American cover, which was the cover art said to have Artorias on it, was art created by Namco Bandai, not From Software like the Japanese cover was, and concept art of Artorias displays him wielding his sword in his right arm, along with a DLC cover art displaying a character that definitely resembles Artorias, reaching for his sword with his right hand. One other aspect to look at for Artorias, like 2x Spooky 4Me suggests, is the pauldron on Artorias' armour. A pauldron is a piece of armour that covers the shoulder, and Artorias has one over his left shoulder, but not his right. X2 Spooky 4Me suggests that this armoured shoulder pad would naturally be on the shield side, in order to allow for extra protection. Melanie's armour also had their armour with more open designs on their right shoulder, which allowed for the wearer to wield that arm with more control and strength. Definitely the arm you want to be controlling your sword. But Vincent Dolan counters that gladiators would often armour their right arm, as the pauldron was used to protecting the leading arm without a shield. This was potentially so that the key body parts of a gladiator could remain, allowing the fight to be drawn out for longer. However, Student of Sword states that actually, in this case the pauldron would be on the left arm, as most fighters being right-handed would strike at the left quadrant of the body. I do like Kane's explanation of Artorias' limp arm, which is that his arm became limp during the fight with Manus, so then he used his now unequipable shield to save Sif. The Cleansing Great Shield states that Artorias, deeply scarred by the Abyss, used this to form a barrier to protect his compatriot Sif. As for the left-handed references in Dark Souls 2, they never do outrightly state that Artorias himself was left-handed, and are more likely nods to the already popular theory that Artorias was left-handed, with his descendant fans subscribed to the tale, and thinking that they are copying Artorias, utilising their left hands. But what we do know is that Ulasil was consumed by the Abyss, with much being lost, and vastly changed throughout time. Outside of the Ulasil township, the Royal Wood is also being affected by the Abyss, and come the current events of Dark Souls 1, the Royal Woods is actually transformed into the Darkroot Garden. Darkroot, the roots of which are dark, darken the Abyss. Leon Professional and Retro Game Audio went through the game areas, both in the map viewer and just general observations, and could tie many of the locations of the Royal Woods to the Darkroot Garden. The Hydra appears in the Darkroot Basin in the same location that Calamite has fought in the past. Black Dragon Calamite is one of the most powerful dragons in Lordran, with Hawkeye Goth explaining his power.
Ferocious dragon indeed, even mighty Anna Londa dared not provoke his ire.
Calamite has a giant red eye on his forehead, with many taking him to be a Cyclops dragon. The obsidian greatsword states that it was formed by the tail of the one-eyed black dragon Calamite, the last of the ancient dragons. But this isn't truly the case, as Calamite actually has two smaller eyes on the side of his face. Most likely the inhabitants of Lordran have nicknamed Calamite as such due to the massive red eye in the centre of his face. It's not actually even known if the giant red dot is even a real eye, or like the basilisk, a red herring. When Calamite is defeated, he drops the Calamity Ring, a ring enchanted by the orange eye of Calamite, the bringer of calamity. In battle, Calamite uses the move, Mark of Calamity, which inflicts the same double damage debuff that the ring possesses. This alludes that the eye on Calamite's head is some sort of calamity eye, maybe even just a stone that can weaken its prey or foes. The Hydras, which appear centuries later, are physically very different to Calamite. But not the spiky Avenger believes that the Hydras are actually formed from the remains of dead dragons. This is based upon the Hydra that we can see in the same location after Calamite has been defeated from the past. And the second Hydra we see is located in the Ash Lake, maybe where many dragon remains lay. An interesting theory I thought I'd briefly mention, but I think the connections there are quite weak. What I'm more confident with is the relationship between Ulasil and the Darkroot Garden, but that's not just where Ulasil's journey ends. Ulasil can even be connected to the lands of Lothric in Dark Souls 3. The rotting wood of Farron Keep seems to bear the scars of the long-lost land of Ulasil. Near the keep ruins is found the corpse of a certain mushroom that we meet in Ulasil. Elizabeth, the godmother of Dusk, whom the chosen undead saves to obtain the broken pendant, seems to have been laid to rest in these ruins, watching over certain item sets. These items include the Crown of Dusk, the feathered crown bestowed upon the princess of Ulasil. Also found in Farron's Keep is the Golden Scroll, which chronicles the vast research of the Xanthus scholars, learning the arts of the lost land of Ulasil. Varys' bow and hat can also be found in Dark Souls 1 and 3, both in Darkroot Garden and the Farron Keep. With so many parallels between Darkroot Garden, Ulasil, and the Farron Keep, it seems that these lands are certainly the same, having been morphed by the Abyss and changed through time. So we've talked about the lands of Ulasil, the bosses of Ulasil, and the potential future after the Abyss changed Ulasil. But what about the inhabitants of Ulasil? Marvelous Chester, one that you find in Ulasil, who has also been snatched from the future into the past, states how Ulasil brought the Abyss upon itself.
Fooled by that toothy serpent, they upturned the grave of primeval man and incited his ornery wrath.
The headpiece armour The Bloated Head states that the creature it was once a part of is the wildly morphed humanity of the residents of Ulasil after they had been devoured by the Dark of Manus, the father of the Abyss. Bloatheads actually look quite similar in appearance to mimics, one of the most mischievous enemies in the game. Tempting many with the disguise of treasure, this can quickly flip into yet another tragic death. With a tongue protruding from a chest, the mimic can't wait for you to fall for their trap of opening their irresistible mouths. Chameleon is a sorcery that will transform a player into an object, such as a pot, a pillar, or a barrel. As the description details, this ancient sorcery originated from the land of Ulasil. It's been theorised that the mimics actually originated as a rogue group of sorcerers from Ulasil who would use chameleon to disguise themselves as chests, waiting for unsuspecting individuals to store their valuables in them, which they would then steal. Mimics have a rare chance of dropping a symbol of avarice. Avarice is the insatiable desire of wealth, basically a form of extreme greed. Dark Souls 1 says that it's a symbol of shame imposed on a long-lost clan, exiled for the sin of avarice, while Dark Souls 3 states that the very form of this creature is thought to be a form of branding, punishment for sin. Apart from the similarities in appearance, the reason for why mimics are thought to have come from Ulasil is to do with one chance encounter that only the lucky few come across during their time in Ulasil. If a bloathead notices a mimic, it points and laughs at the mimic, almost as if taunting its branded and punished counterpart, condemning them for their sins. Ironically though, both the mimic and bloatheads have been morphed by the Abyss, wreaking havoc upon many through their trickery attacks. One individual, who would have not been fazed in the slightest by these antics, was Tarkus. Black Iron Tarkus, as the Great Sword hints, could have been the Knights of Berenik. The Knights of Berenik were known for their heavy armour, being extremely strong and the mightiest of mighty. The Phantom of Tarkus can be summoned to help fight against the Iron Golem, but the Tarkus Phantom can do what many others cannot. Tarkus can defeat the Iron Golem all by himself, without the player's involvement. The original Let Me Solo Her, Tarkus is a legend among many. Throughout Sen's Fortress, hollowed Berenik Knights paint the tapestry of the struggles the Knights faced, completing the challenges set by the Land of Lordran. However, it's heavily implied that Tarkus managed to complete this fortress. Preceding Sen's Fortress, a hole can be found while traversing the beams above. Displaying the large canvas of the painted world of Ariamas, a corpse can be found in the corner, just to the left of the canvas. Containing Tarkus' Black Iron Great Shield and his Black Iron set, it's highly likely that this is the mighty Tarkus body. This placement made many believe that Tarkus, upon completing Sen's Fortress, became unbalanced on the beams in the hall, and tragically fell to his death, with his body being dragged to the corner by the Painting Guardian. But why would someone who has conquered one of the most frustrating areas in Dark Souls just clumsily fall from the rafters? Maybe Tarkus did not really die by gravity. The beams in Analondo are the exact same width as the beam in Sen's Fortress, so could he have been so clumsy to just fall off because of a few throwing knives? I'd argue that swinging axes are a lot more difficult. Link Arcus believes that Tarkus indeed did make it down to the halls without falling, but became overwhelmed by the nimbleness of the Painting Guardians. But would the weak attacks of the Guardians even manage to dent the armour of mighty Tarkus? I'm not that convinced. Prince Shataku theorises that Tarkus did not actually complete the Sen's Fortress, but was actually thrown by the Iron Golem all the way to the chapel, creating a hole in the window for the chosen undead to later enter. The crestfallen merchant at Sen's Fortress admits to Tarkus' failure.
Don't even consider visiting Analondo, not in your state. For a century they've tried and failed. The Night King Rendell, Black Iron Tarkus, and even Logan himself. You won't stand a chance, you'll be eaten alive.
So did Tarkus really not make it to Analondo? Well, we see his corpse, so he must have. I guess being thrown by an Iron Golem could be considered cheating your way to Analondo, but I don't think Tarkus would have let that happen. As we've said, even his Phantom can solo the Iron Golem, so it'd be safe to assume that the real Tarkus could perform such similar heroics. He is the best, after all. Justin Priest also had these same doubts, and subscribed to another theory about Tarkus' adventures. Maybe Tarkus' corpse isn't actually from his first entry into Analondo. Perhaps it's actually from his exit from the painted world of Ariamas. The origin of this rumour seems to be from 5.9, where he notes that a lone knight, another Knight of Berenik, can be found guarding the way to Priscilla. Perhaps his Knights of Berenik were a platoon for their leader Tarkus, with Tarkus ordering one of his men to guard the exits while he went to face Priscilla. The hollows found throughout the painted world are also much stronger than the other hollows we find throughout the Undead Berg. Perhaps these may have also been part of Tarkus' expedition. But what we do know is that Tarkus is dead. Perhaps he was weakened by Priscilla, or surprised by the Painting Guardians, waiting for him to come back at the Analondo Chapel. Or maybe, like Kitsune Hero speculates, Tarkus was fatally wounded by Priscilla due to her invisibility, dragging herself over to the edge of the painting before dying of blood loss. It is said that if you sneakily move past the bridge in the painted world, you can see the Berenik Knights staring towards the fog gate of Priscilla. Maybe they witnessed the fall of the mighty Tarkus, causing themselves to hollow. But there is one interesting conundrum with this theory. For the chosen undead to enter the painted world, they need to be in possession of a peculiar doll. By clutching this doll tightly, they are drawn into the cold and lonely painted world. Now Tarkus and his gang would not have had this doll in their possession. Well, maybe the doll isn't actually a key to entering the painted world, but some sort of representation of one. Maybe you are allowed to enter the painted world if you have something that Priscilla wants. With the chosen undead is the peculiar doll. For Tarkus, maybe it was something else. As Salda best points out, the Berenik Knights absolutely made their way into the painted world, so if they could do it, then surely there was a way for Tarkus as well. Even outside of Dark Souls, it seems that we must also be holding the peculiar doll, as we are being drawn to the next layer of the iceberg, the painted world. almost dreamlike landscape filled with snowy structures. The Painted World is a place full of outcasts. When the chosen undead first enters the Painted World of Ariamis, they find themselves on a bridge, leading them towards this strange land. The opposite side of this wooden bridge is cut off, with no way to determine what it leads to. Herald of Xena supposes that maybe this bridge was originally meant to lead to the Undead Asylum, but the bridge was destroyed, with the world then being placed within a painted realm. Like the Painted World of Ariamis, the Undead Asylum has an abrupt cutoff, where the Crow's Nest now resides. In the Design Works interview, Miyazaki did state that the Painted World of Ariamis was a place where a lot of unfinished content was placed. Well, maybe the shell of Ariamis, the world, was also cut content. Many parallels can be seen between the Undead Asylum and the Painted World. Both are primarily populated with hollows, more specifically torch hollows. But this could just be evidence of Tarkus and his party entering the world of Ariamis, and nothing further. But both worlds are also in a state of disrepair, with what's left being riddled with themes of punishment. Sacks are placed over the head of hollows, cages are found in both areas, and wheel skeletons represent the torturing technique of tying an individual to a wheel. Or an even more similar comparison, as Zing Lokia Batar 3205 points out, the Moscas torture wheels from Berserk. Both areas heavily feature crows and crow-like imagery. Even the sky has a similar cloudy texture. Asylums in the Middle Ages were often coupled with the presence of a church. For example, one of London's most notorious insane asylums, Bethlehem Hospital, more commonly known as Bedlam, had a modest number of 12 cells for patients during the 13th century. Along with a kitchen, accommodation for staff, and an exercise yard, these buildings were surrounding a central courtyard holding a chapel in the centre. The Undead Asylum in Lordran does not have the presence of a church, but there is one located in the Painted World of Ariamis. One connection could be a coincidence, but when we reach this many connections, surely there's something else that meets the eye. And perhaps there is, but not in the way that Herald of Xena proposes. In the Design Works interview, Miyazaki states that the Painted World is actually based upon the map used in the Dark Souls prototype. So while many pieces, like Priscilla, ended up being cut from the game, a lot of the spirit of the map remains, with strong parallels between those two worlds just being the root inspiration of the prototype world. As Joa Sonoto 6929 points out, the Painted World of Ariamis isn't the only painted world of the Dark Souls universe. Come the event of Dark Souls 3, there is a painted world known as the Painted World of Ariandel.
Rejoice, my new friend, for this is a true haven of the forlorn, the cold and gentle painted world of Ariandel. Quick, go along. Find one for yourself. A sweetly rotting bed to lie upon.
The Painted World of Ariandel seems to be a place for the wanted and the lonely to seek asylum. So are these two painted worlds really different? Well, not necessarily. There is one theory that the Painted World of Ariandel is still in fact the Painted World of Ariamis. As said by Priscilla, the Painted World of Ariamis was created by their namesake.
Didst thou not see why Ariamis created this world?
So the same could be assumed for Ariandel, that it was created by Father Ariandel. But the Rose of Ariandel states that Ariandel was the restorer of the Painted World, painting the world with blood, with only blood protecting the secret. Draxanelli went through the Painted World and noted many similarities with the physical landscape. Both had similar towers, similar statues, and even similar bridges. Even the design work artworks is very similar between the worlds. Because of this, it's quite likely that the worlds of Ariamis and Ariandel are the same. If this is the case, then the closed-off landscape behind the rope bridge in Ariamis is finally revealed come the world of Ariandel, revealing a wooded forest that is nothing like the Undead Asylum, with the Painted World being severed from all connections. The Painted World itself has a cycle, with the burning of the world the way to clean it from rot.
Surely you've seen the rot that afflicts our world, but that which fooled the good father and buried the flame.
Father Ariandel uses blood to appease the fire, pausing the cycle. Another painter in the world of Ariandel is imprisoned at the Corvian settlement, and unable to see flame, so cannot paint a world.
Those who aren't kin to fire cannot paint a world.
Her figurative uncle, Slave Knight Gale, acts as her protective figure. The Ashen One finds Gale initially praying at the Cathedral of the Deep, with Gale being determined to burn the painted world, using its ashes to create a new one, renewing the cycle. He's so loyal to the painter, so much so that he obtained the Dark Soul from the Ring City, fully aware that it will ultimately be his own downfall. Consumed by the Dark Soul, Gale clashes with the Ashen One, but partway through this fight, he realises that his blood is the blood of the Dark Souls, and turns hollow, realising that he's completed his quest of obtaining the Dark Soul, trusting that the Ashen One will return his blood to the painter. But why would Gale sacrifice his being to renew the painting, and display his devotion to the painter? Nightboy42 believes that Slave Knight Gale may actually be the protagonist from Dark Souls 2, the bearer of the curse. Dark Souls 2 has two different endings. One where the bearer of the curse proceeds to the throne, accepting their role in the cycle of the world. But in the other ending, the bearer of the curse can reject the throne entirely, walking away with the only motivation for this known by the bearer of the curse themselves. Nightboy42 supposes that with this second ending, the bearer of the curse is resolved to find another way, rather than succumb to the cycle. Perhaps this other way is in fact the Ariandel cycle, where they burn the world and use the ashes to create a new world. Gale, being the bearer of the curse, finally finds another outcome, and devotes his life to this painter's new option that he's been pursuing for years. While this theory does sound exciting, there are still many unanswered questions. One is, how did Gale obtain the Slave Knight title? Slave Knights were said to be around long ago, when the undead served as Slave Knights, being fodder in the bleakest of battles. It's thought that the Slave Knights fought under Gwyn due to Gale's usage of the Way of White Corona, a long-lost Way of White miracle, with the Way of White Covenant being followers of the Great Lord Gwyn. So with this, it's thought that Gale actually predates even Dark Souls 2, having been around since Dark Souls 1. The painting in Dark Souls 1 was home to crossbreed Priscilla, but it's nowhere to be found come the events of Dark Souls 3. A young pale girl, Priscilla shares a faint resemblance to the painter. This led some, like Sundown Kid, to theorise that the painter is actually Priscilla's daughter. Most of the evidence for this connection is merely physical appearance, so the theory already begins on shaky ground. But perhaps this drives a deeper motive for Gale and the painter. Gale could have been a slave knight while Priscilla was still around, and perhaps wanted revenge for Priscilla's daughter by defeating Frida and setting the painted world aflame. But there's pretty much no evidence for this, so there's even little evidence for what happened to Priscilla. If the chosen undead decide to fight Priscilla and cut off her tail, the weapon of Priscilla's dagger is formed. Possessing the power of Life Hunt, it dances when wielded, in a fashion reminiscent of the white robe painting Guardians. Life Hunt is a power that we don't know much about, but it's something that the gods feared, which is why Priscilla was locked away in the painted world to begin with. In Dark Souls 3, a miracle exists known as Life Hunt's Scythe, used by the devourer of gods Aldrich. Aldrich dreamt as he slowly devoured the god of the Dark Moon. In this dream, he perceived the form of a young, pale girl in hiding, the Saint of the Deep and the Devourer of Gods. Aldrich had an unsatiable craving for human flesh, with his devouring of both flesh and soul bloating him so much so that he collapsed upon himself, becoming a massive sludge animated by the darkness. Epion Trace supposes that one of those that Aldrich consumed was Priscilla. When Aldrich consumes individuals, he seems to take part of them upon himself, and perhaps this is how he obtained Life Hunt, from Priscilla. Zedran rightly counters this theory though, and points out that the Life Hunt Scythe is a miracle. The miracle heal in Dark Souls states that to cast a miracle, the caster learns a tale of the gods, and says a prayer to be blessed by its revelations. So Aldrich didn't actually need to consume Priscilla for him to obtain Life Hunt. He would just have to dream, which is what the miracle states happened. But we can be more confident about some other gods that Aldrich has consumed. Aldrich was given many sacrifices by the followers of the Church of the Deep, which he founded. He was revived as a Lord of Cinder, and began dreaming of the old gods who supported the linking of the fire. He became infatuated with devouring them, travelling all the way to Analondo, capturing and then attempting to devour the Dark Sun Gwyndolin. But maybe there are even more that Aldrich has taken into his form. the blade at the end of Aldrich's staff seems to have a striking resemblance to the Gravelord Greatsword, which is a sword wielded by the servants of Gravelord Nito. Aldrich's robe also seems very similar to Nito's, and looking at the floor around Aldrich, there are hundreds of bones of Aldrich's consumed victims. Like Gwyndolin, Aldrich could have consumed Gravelord Nito, absorbing his powers, perhaps on his way from his coffin to Anor Londo. Or perhaps just by consuming Gwyndolin, Aldrich gained the memories of other gods as well, allowing him to mantle Nito and consume the role of a Grave Lord. But the theory that interests me the most is one suggested by Miko Williams, and that's of Aldrich's identity before he entered his coffin. He proposes that Aldrich is executioner Smough. Granted, both Aldrich and Smough are encountered in the same cathedral in Anor Londo. Smough was also a cannibal, grinding the bones of his victims into his own feed. Harkwood does say,
"Let's take Aldrich for one, a right and proper cleric. Only he developed a habit of devouring men, and they made him a lord of Cinder, not for virtue, but for might."
Not for virtue, but for might would be an apt description for Smough. So could Smough really have become Aldrich? Perhaps Smough leaves the cathedral to look for another purpose, and ends up becoming a cleric for the Church of the Deep, while changing his name to Aldrich. But one thing didn't change, and that was his gluttony. He succumbs to his cannibalistic nature and begins consuming, becoming more and more powerful and gathering followers who provide sacrifices. Strangely, Smough's armour set does not become purchasable from the Shrine Handmaid until after the death of Aldrich. But I think these are more echoes of a cathedral as opposed to parallels between Aldrich and Smough. While Smough was a cannibal, he was a royal executioner and did not murder his victims. He ground the bones of his victims so they were dead before he consumed them. While Aldrich rather had the desire to share with others his joy of imbibing the final shadows of life while luxuriating in his victims' screams. So while they are both cannibals, the satisfaction of eating flesh are almost entirely different. But corruption does work in mysterious ways. Now perhaps like me, you can feel the deep sea beckoning us from below. Before we plunge down further, there are a few more mysteries in the painted world for us to still solve. Once the Ashen One defeats Isafrida and return Gale's darkened pigments to the painter, she begins painting a new world.
"'Twill be a cold, dark, and very gentle place, and one day it will make someone a goodly home."
But what will this world actually become? This world that is born by blood. Bloodborne. Bloodborne's world of Yharnam is not what you would briefly describe as a cold and gentle place. While Bloodborne does share Dark Souls' underlying repetition, it doesn't seem that likely that there'll be a link, especially considering Sony's exclusivity with Bloodborne. Glass Eye Sliv proposes that the painter's painting is not leading to Yharnam, but it's actually a portal to the lands between, the land of Elden Ring. The inhabitants of Elden Ring worship many gods, with many of them being mysterious beings known as the Outer Gods, gods that need vessels to enact their influence upon the land. One Outer God, known as the Mother of Truth, bestows power to Mogwin. Upon accursed blood, the Mother of Truth desires a wound. Glass Eye Sliv supposes that the wound could represent the painter's need for retribution due to Gale's sacrifice, while the blood associated is through the paint she birthed the world with. But Miyazaki did state in the IGN Summer of Gaming interview that Elden Ring is a different world to Dark Souls, which I guess we could still argue that it could exist inside a painting, but this will most likely never be confirmed. I do like the way Never Paid for Skype describes the painting, with its completion never actually observed, so the painting could really be any game, it's just up to the interpretation of the player. Apart from Priscilla, the world of Ariamis is called home to another mysterious and potentially highly regarded individual. Jeremiah, Xanthus' king, has been exiled to this painted world. And for some strange reason, he has remarkable similarities to a parasitic wallhugger found in Blighttown. This wallhugger guards a pyromancy scroll, and Jeremiah also uses pyromancy along with a whip, which can also be found near the wallhugger. Concept art of Jeremiah even displays him with some sort of parasitic infection. But this isn't as deep as the parasitic rabbit hole goes. Jeremiah is a king, but what was he a king of? He was exiled into the painted world, but where was he exiled from? His title, Xanthus King could mean Blonde King, referring to the colour of hair, or marked by yellow coloration. But let's hold on to that thought for now, and delve into Hawkshaw's theory that Jeremiah was actually king of Izalith. So we know that the Painted World is a place where lots of cut content was placed, and in a DesignWorks interview, art designer Masanori Waragai states that King Izalith was originally going to be the boss of Izalith, sitting in a throne where the bed of chaos lays. Risen Seeker uncovered game data folders which contain nicknames of all of the enemies in Dark Souls. The parasitic warhugger was called Prince Izalith, which could mean the Prince of Izalith. So if Jeremiah was the cut king of Izalith, this similar looking parasitic warhugger could actually be his son. But let us cycle back to Jeremiah's name, the Xanthus King. David Macchion Lay 3586 and Kaelin Francis 4965 actually believe that Jeremiah could really be the king of Ulasil rather than the king of Izalith. When we were looking into linking the Deeproot Gardens, Farron Keep and Ulasil, we uncovered the Golden Scroll, which chronicled the vast research of the Xanthus scholars. In the lost land of Ulasil, the sorcerers orchestrated light, and were said to shine in golden hue. Also in Dark Souls 3 is the Xanthus Crown, a crown made in imitation of a divine creature in Ulasil, land of ancient golden sorceries. Xanthus clothing is the mark of a researcher of lost sorceries, and the oversized crown is emblematic of their work. Such a curious pursuit is surely nothing to be ashamed of. So Jeremiah could have hailed from Ulasil, or just been researching lost sorceries. Perhaps the altercation with Manners in Ulasil was the very reason as to why Jeremiah was exiled. The foundational reference for the Xanthus King was likely to have been The King in Yellow, written by Robert W. Chambers. These stories inspired H.P. Lovecraft, which heavily inspired Miyazaki's work. The Yellow King is a play that drives the reader mad, with it being suggested that the colour yellow represents decay and mental illness. So perhaps Jeremiah is also a mad king, or even a fake, deluded by his own readings. Well, it's not a play that's drawing us in, so I think we're safe. It's the deep sea, beckoning us to immerse ourselves into the next layer of the iceberg. The Deep Protection states that the deep was originally a peaceful and sacred place, but became the final rest for many abhorrent things. When Aldrich ruminated on the fading of the fire, it inspired visions of a coming age of the deep sea. Aldrich established the Cathedral of the Deep, and seems to be delivering the Age of the Deep Sea. The Age of the Deep Sea does seem quite similar to the Abyss, the Age of Darkness, and the Wolf Knight's greatsword could suggest this. This sword is more punishing against the creations of the Abyss, and this bonus damage also extends its way to Aldrich, who's the Saint of the Deep. So perhaps these two were not dissimilar, with maybe the Deep being some cult of worship that has branched away from the Abyss. But Ratatoska rather elegantly proposes that the Deep and the Abyss are different in their video What is the Deep? He suggests that the Deep is even a form of liquid. The murky hand scythe is wielded by the Merkmen who rise from the depths, enveloped by a black dampness and imbued with the strength of dark. The black dampness suggests that the Deep is in fact a liquid, a real sea. Found helpless in a cell, Irina of Karim speaks about the darkness that envelops her.
Please, whoever you are, touch me. The dark surrounds me, nibbles at my flesh. Little creatures, they never stop biting. So please, hold out your hand and touch me.
We could relate this to humanity, with the Firekeeper's soul stating that below just a thin layer of skin are swarms of humanity that writhe and squirm. But these little creatures are more likely a reference to the insects of the deep, stating that these insects which lurk in the deep have tiny jaws lined with fangs to tear open the skin and burrow into the flesh in the blink of an eye. The Locust Preacher subtly mentions Irina's endeavours.
And so, she lived in fear of the dark, of the things that gnawed at her flesh. And yet, the Abyss hath yet to produce any such creature. Fear not the dark, my friend, and let the feast begin.
So while the Deep has these small insects, the Abyss does not. This for me solidifies that the Deep and the Abyss are different. Even though the Cathedral of the Deep was introduced into Dark Souls come the third game, The thought of the deep might have been tugging at the minds of inquisitive individuals, well before anyone was released into the land of Lothric. The land of Dark Souls 2, Dran Lake, is thought to potentially be located within the deep. We haven't mentioned Dark Souls 2 for a good half an hour in this video, and that's because it's often hard to relate Dark Souls 2 to a lot of theories. The land of Dran Lake seems quite dreamlike, and it's often disconnected from the other worlds of Lordran and Lothric. The land of Dran Lake is twisted, changing and morphing through its dark influences. Access Cambria suggests that Dran Lake is actually located within the deep. Looking out from one of the windows at the Cathedral of the Deep, deep below, a dark lake can be seen. If we cast our mind back to the beginning of Dark Souls 2, the opening cinematic also has the bearer of the curse falling through a lake, into the land of Dran Lake. This could be the very same Lake of the Deep that is coming to consume Lothric. The Mace of Insolent in Dark Souls 2 describes its past wielder as a formerly high-ranking cleric, whose soul now wanders aimlessly in the depths of a murky darkness. Now could this murky darkness be a reference to the deep? The deep seems to harbour Great Soul Dregs, with the sorcery Great Soul Dregs stating that the Dark Soul Dregs have stewed for ages, far within the deep. Some of the mercmen who rise from the depths are possessed by soul dregs, which have a grave likeness to the human form. While possible, it seems that the term darkness implies the abyss, rather than being more explicit with the term deep. And Chaos Spectra supposes that Dran Lake is actually in the abyss. The Cathedral of the Deep houses the Drang Hammers and the Drang Sets. The Drang Knights were once feared sellswords, until treason meant descending into the abyss, and they were separated forever. In Dran Lake, a very similar set, the Llewellyn sets, can be found. Could this be the set of the Banished Knights? The Drang Lake Knights? Deep into the Sinner's Rise is the Lost Sinner, who eternally punishes herself from the sins of her past. Sweet Xiaoqua, a merchant found in Majula, discusses the tragedy of the Lost Sinner.
The Lost Sinner lives deep within the Bastille. The fool, trying to light the first flame.
It seems that the Lost Sinner was somehow forbidden from lighting the flame, and was even locked up for doing so. Perhaps she was locked up for trying to stop the Abyss from taking control of Dran Lake. The soul of the Lost Sinner states that the Lost Sinner is eternally punishing herself for the sins of her past. So if she did want to bring back the Age of Fire, would she then really go and punish herself for her actions? An interesting thought, and Holding Knight doesn't think that Dran Lake is in the Abyss, or in the Deep, but it's just a story, being the plot of King Vendrick's dreams. The Lord Vessel is a crucial item in Lordran, bestowed upon the chosen undead, and allowing them to approach the kiln of the first flame. Yet when the bearer of the curse adventures through Dran Lake, in the basement of an inconspicuous mansion in Majula, we can see the shards of what could have possibly been the Lord Vessel. A large bowl, it's bestowed upon the chosen undead to be filled with powerful souls, a tool to aid the succession of Lord Gwyn. But why would something of such huge significance in the first Souls games be destroyed and stowed in an easily missable area? One reason for this is that it could just be fan service to Souls fans, providing Easter eggs linking Dark Souls 2 back to the first game. Actual Wasp proposes that it could be the lack of acknowledgement of the Lord Vessel that conveys the amount of time that has passed since the first game. This time difference can also be seen with the Black Knight Greatsword, which was used by many of the Black Knights found within Lordran. But come Dran Lake, the description of the Black Knight Greatsword states that it was wielded by knights who served in a long-forgotten age. Interestingly, behind a wall where the broken Lord Vessel was in the mansion, there's actually a completed Lord Vessel. So what could this strange occurrence mean? Some speculate that it was placed for a potentially cut DLC. But crucially, what this does is confirm that the pieces we see scattered around are in fact the Lord Vessel, and not just a coincidence. The completed vessel would have most likely been placed there while the map modelers broke it up and placed it throughout the mansion, and then just forgot to clean up the original model in the process. Holding Knight believes the Lord Vessel being both broken and neglected could actually represent the forgetting about the real world, with the long forgotten age actually being life outside of the dream. When the bearer of the curse is first introduced into the game, they are greeted by bright bugs, which share a resemblance to fireflies. Fireflies are common symbolism in dreams, representing hope, as their bodies produce light. The land you awake in, Things Betwixt, has a mysterious aura, acting as a connector between worlds. And through here you enter Dran Lake. And in the beautiful Majula, Emerald warns you,
lest this land swallow you whole.
Could the Dreamland be trying to keep you here? Aiding people to forget of their lost life, allowing them to slip away from it? The bearer of the curse has forgotten about their past, and in the introduction, Dran Lake is a land that is hinted that may have already been seen.
Perhaps you've seen it. Maybe in a dream. A murky, forgotten land.
So could this be a dream right now? Ash and Shroom suggest that rather than this being thought of like a dream, it should be thought of more like an afterlife. In the introduction of Dark Souls 2, before we ascend to the things betwixt, we hear a song, sung by the Milfinito. The Milfinito were given song by the Great Dead One. Grave Warden Agdane is also a Finito, whose task is to watch over the dead, being granted to do so by the ones who gave him the first death. Both of these individuals imply that they were created by the Dead One, Gravelord Nito, so the bearer of the curse's introduction into Dran Lake could actually be representing their entry into the afterlife. Either way though, the place of Dran Lake is a real place within Dark Souls, as King Vendrick is suggested in Dark Souls 3, with his demising, all-consuming thirst being mentioned in the Shield of Want. So perhaps Vendrick was not consumed by the quest to rid the curse without lighting the first flame, but instead was consumed by the same dream the bearer of the curse is in. The goal of lighting the fire could just be the goal to wake up.
I too sought fire once.
When the bearer of the curse attempts to attack Vendrick, he states that they are foolish and that they can't defeat him in his world. Maybe this is because it's his dream, and as the ruler, he can make up his own rules. The placement of Dran Lake in Dark Souls seems to be greatly influenced by this broken Lord Vessel found in Majula Mansion, but the Lord Vessel might not even be as special as it first appears. In Lothric, the Firelink Shrine bonfire seems to be held by a Lord Vessel, and the High Wall also has a similar looking bowl with a broken coiled sword in it. So perhaps the Lord Vessel was not related to the chosen undead, but significant to the original owner of the Majula Mansion. By the time the bearer of the curse arrives at Majula, the only person loosely associated with the mansion is Kale the cartographer.
Have you seen Majula? Oh, there's a rather spacious mansion there. I've made it my temporary home. Well, as something of a squatter, I'm afraid.
Kale is fascinated by the map found in Majula Mansion, which seems to light up in flames when bonfires are lit. Navlan, the royal sorcerer, also mentions the cartographer Kale.
I want you to kill one more. Your target will be Kale, the man who's drafting that map. While I was trapped in here, he touched me, that maniac, like I was some rare specimen.
Navlan is imprisoned in Oldia's Keep, and if we are to take his word for it means that Kale ventured to Oldia's Keep to inspect Navlan. But some, like Geo de Ray, believe the truth is a bit more complex than presented by Navlan, and that Kale actually broke the Lord Vessel. Navlan explains to the bearer of the curse how he came to be imprisoned.
This contains my power. Long ago, this naive vessel of mine set about devising new spells. The fool dreamt of bringing new forms of magic into the world, but instead, he created me. Mostly by chance, but he did a fine job, I must say. While my vessel slept, I'd find my mark and hunt him down. But my vessel did not approve. And so while I slept, he sealed the both of us away.
It seems that Navlan is a body wrestling in the control of two beings. Ryo and Pleasantly Lemon Fresh speculate that Navlan, at least part of him, was originally the owner of the Majula Mansion. The Majula Mansion contained a study with a large book, and this could indicate that a scholar of some sort lived there. However, this could simply be argued as a study set up by Kale to help with his cartography. The chosen undead uses the Lord Vessels to hold the souls of the four old ones. Perhaps Navlan was studying this Lord Vessel, attempting to do what most sorcerers seem to do, discover immortality, or to resurrect the death into life. Perhaps by creating a smaller vessel for his own soul to fill. A special chest in Majula's mansion contains a soul vessel, a vessel that will accept your soul, but without proper assistance, it may simply drain you of souls. Perhaps Navlan stored his own soul in this vessel, and his forbidden hexes were revealed. As the Scraps of Life states, the heretic Navlan was executed along with his entire village, and the mere utterance of his name became a crime. Some say it was because he sought to restore the banned art of resurrection. This village could have been Majula, with all of their inhabitants murdered, with perhaps the Lord Vessel broken at the time, or later upon the curiosity of Kael. But Navlan, who transferred his soul into the soul vessel, became trapped, slowly going insane, until a royal sorcerer from Aldia's Keep's curiosity got the better of him, and when searching for new sorceries, discovered the soul vessel in Majula Mansion, allowing Navlan to vessel his body and take control. This could be why Navlan is not only intent to kill Kael, the man who's touched his property, but also other asylums of Majula, those that have infiltrated his town. The merchant laddersmith Gilligan, and Falcon the Outcast, who is found just outside Majula. But there is one more very interesting individual that Navlan requests us to kill.
I want you to kill the girl in Majula, known as the Muse. They say that she is the last firekeeper, but they say a lot of things. That she's a gentle shepherd, lighting the way for you cursed fools. Nonsense.
The girl that Navlan is referring to is Emerald Herald, also known as Charlotte, one who seems to selflessly aid the bearer of the curse in their quest to link the flame. But what if all is not what it seems? Originally, the bearer of the curse is in Drangleic to just cure the curse, but Charlotte guides you to become the next monarch.
Great Sovereign, take your throne. What lies ahead, only you can see.
Charlotte later reveals that she was born of dragons, and can drive by men. However, the dragon that you later encounter, the ancient dragon, is revealed to be a prop by Queen Nashandra.
Brave undead, what did that dragon tell you? That thing is a prop, a false deity. Don't be fooled, my undead.
The ancient dragon was created by Aldia, and seems to have been created from giants, dropping a soul of a giant, and many dead giants can be found around Aldia's Keep. Like the other dragons in the game, could Emerald Herald also be a mirage, painted by Aldia? Perhaps this could be the sinister lies that Navlan is privy to knowing. There are 4 queens in the game, and each of these queens were formed from a shard of Manus. Each of these queens found a king to cling on to, and gather power as a way to get revenge on humanity from Manus' defeat in Dark Souls 1. All of these queens manipulate those around them in order to achieve their true, sinister goals. So what if Emerald Herald is actually attaching herself to you, the Great Sovereign? Maybe Shadowlight is in fact another daughter of Manus, slowly harvesting souls from the bearer of the curse, while slowly making the bearer of the curse more powerful the longer they are under her spell. Vendrick mentions that Manus,
one of the Father of the Abyss spawn, that confounded quintessence of humanity.
Zar supposes that quintessence, while defined as being the most perfect or prime example of quality, could also mean 5, with quintessence in classical and medieval philosophy meaning a 5th substance in addition to the 4 elements. So this could both mean that Manus is the perfect example of the dark side of humanity, and a hint that there are actually 5 queens instead of 4. Could the Emerald Herald be this supposed hidden 5th queen? 4 is a number that carries heavy connotation in Japanese culture. It can be pronounced as she, which is also the word for death. This number is a recurring theme in the Souls games, with the 4 kings, the 4 knights of wind, the 4 old ones, and many more. So it would make more sense that these queens consisted of 4 rather than 5. Another mentioning of 4 within Dark Souls 2 is the 4 Firekeepers. The Things Betwixt contains a lonely house with 3 elderly firekeepers, along with their younger housekeeper Millibeth.
My name is Millibeth. The old women were once firekeepers. The old women are sisters. I am told there was a 4th.
Ever since Millibeth has known them, there has only been 3. So who could this 4th firekeeper be? Millibeth states that now, firekeepers are lost, being scattered to the winds. So maybe our 4th firekeeper is also somewhere out there in the winds. Drog loosely theorises that this 4th firekeeper could be Anastasia of Astora, a firekeeper from Lordran. There was a Forlorn in Dark Souls 2 known as the Dark Spirit of the Forlorn Sisters that would invade the bearer of the curse at the pit below Majula. It was theorised that this could have been Anastasia, but there's no real evidence for this, or for the fact that she would indeed be the 4th firekeeper, other than the basis, they are all firekeepers and women. In fact, the Forlorn Sister characters seemingly disappeared, with Pondwater clarifying that the Forlorn Sister was most likely renamed to the Dingy Cleric Phantom, with both of these characters dropping a dingy set. I'm a Tool 2 thinks that the Shrine Handmaiden from the Firelink Shrine is in fact this 4th Firekeeper. She dresses in a very similar way to the things betwixt Firekeepers, but there really isn't much more evidence than this. Other people such as Prince Niao theorise that the 4th Firekeeper, who was lost to the winds, could in fact be the Lost Sinner, with the Lost Sinner trying to light the first flame, that perhaps the 4th Firekeeper wished to bring back the Age of Fire, unlike her sisters, and was punished for attempting such a task. Navlan does state that many people also rumour that Emerald Herald herself could be a Firekeeper, but does not really believe that to be the case. The 4th Firekeeper is most likely to be the narrator that we are introduced to at the start of the playthrough. This old lady is of similar age, and has a similar appearance to the 3 Firekeepers. And the other 3 Firekeepers do reference the narrator.
You spoke to that kind old dear, didn't you?
One theory is that the old woman found in the introduction of the game is actually the older Emerald Herald, but the credits actually credit this narrator to an individual by the name of Nicolette Mackenzie, with Shadowlot being credited to the voice Ruth Negger. You'd assume if these were the same individuals, they would have the same voice actor, as they are both adult portrayals. But interestingly, there's another actor for the character called Child Channelot. Originally it was assumed that this Child Channelot would be introduced as a later DLC, but this never eventuated. So who could this child be? As we converse with Emerald Heralds, it can be identified that her voice changes pitch. In Majula, her voice is much lower.
Bearer of the curse, I will remain by your side, till this frail hope shatters.
Compared to the Emerald Herald and the Dragon Airy.
Bearer of the curse, long have I awaited one such as you.
While some people argue that the voice actor just changed their tone between recordings, the Dragon Airy being the younger Emerald Herald could be a plausible explanation. When Emerald Herald meets the Bearer of the Curse at the Dragon Airy, she states that it was her own manifestation that led the bearer there. Many people did relate this to the narrator being Shadowlot's manifestation, bringing the player to Dranlaek. But what if this manifestation is actually the adult Emerald Herald in Majula, which brought the player to Dragon Airy? But the true explanation for Child Channelot can be uncovered through examining cut content further. Dark Souls 2 didn't have the best time with development. Miyazaki, the creator of the Soul series, took a hands-off approach on the project and allowed new directors Tomohiro Shibuya and Yui Tanimura freedom and creativity while he was working on Bloodborne. However, halfway into development, the higher-ups at From Software concluded that the pathway that Dark Souls 2 was taking was undesirable, and Shibuya was seemingly demoted, with Tanimura being the sole director of the project. Through this, the entire narrative and world were rewritten. For example, the tranquil scenery of Majula was actually intended to be a hub of sorts, depicting far larger structures than what was included in the final project. Even though the narrative for this game was greatly changed, the original dialogue can still be found. In an early network test version of the game, some Japanese dialogue files were recovered. In the original dialogue of the game, a scholar known as Veldrick tells us of the Pendulum of Time. Initially, the Pendulum of Time wouldn't move, and the world was running rampant with demons. The Pendulum of Time needed to be assembled with a Dragon's Jewel and a Drop of Time, and then a hole in the logic of the universe would open, and the player could then cross time. The original Dark Souls teaser website actually had a pendulum that was teased, so perhaps this idea was left, or matured for the second game, until it was later cut. Veldrick's dialogue is the most interesting that we can find left from the original narrative, but there's one more character of utmost importance from this script, Child Channelot. It seemed that when you use the Pendulum of Time and headed back into the past, Child Channelot is some sort of companion, with the Bearer of the Curse giving Child Channelot a feather, which older Channelot returns at the start of the original game. So perhaps the Child Channelot was actually credited in the game, while unfortunately all her lines ended up being cut. And a lot of narrative within Dark Souls can actually be observed with a more detailed perspective when regarding cut content. But to explore that, we need to enter the depths layer of this iceberg. And it's in these depths that we can find a primordial serpent, Darkstalker Carve. The primordial serpents are two serpents, Kingseeker Frams and Darkstalker Carve, who both try to influence the chosen undead into bringing about their age. Frampt urges the player to become the successor for Gwyn, prolonging the Age of Fire. Karth, on the other hand, wishes the chosen undead to no longer rekindle the first flame, bringing about the Age of Dark. The Spirit Force believes that despite their differences, Karth and Frampt could have one sinister goal in mind, and maybe even being the same being, with Kingseeker Frampt just being a false identity made by Karth. When Karth encounters the chosen undead, he warns them of Frampt.
I seek to right the wrongs of the past, to discover our true lord. But the other serpent, Frampt, lost his sense and befriended Lord Gwyn.
The chosen undead can choose to side with Karth and turn against Frampt. If you do so, you would think that Frampt will be quite upset by this, but he is more so neutral, slightly crestfallen.
You sorry fool. You could not be the chosen one. Enough. I shall slumber until I am awakened again.
It's quite strange that Frampt would give up so easily when the chosen undead, one he's been guiding, had become lost in their ways. But perhaps things become clearer when Karth's ending is picked.
Let Karth and Frampt serve your highness.
So Frampt seems to be secretly biting for the Age of Dark too? So why would he be convincing people to continue the Age of Fire? Well, the Spirit Force suggests that this is actually to test the chosen undead, to see if they are worthy of the title of the Dark Lord. If one is curious enough, probing at the words veiled by Frampt, and they venture into the abyss and seek the truth with Karth, they are then a candidate to bring about the Age of Dark. Knight of Astora, Oscar, rescues the chosen undead at the first place revealed in Lordran, the Undead Asylum, but then quickly meets his fate, found dying within the same place. But Oscar was originally meant to be someone that the chosen undead bonded with throughout the Dark Souls storyline, even helping you fight the fierce band of thieves in the Darkroot Garden. Ultimately, Oscar would become the antagonist near the conclusion of the game, with Oscar confronting you with a primordial serpent that you yourself did not choose. No matter which choice you made, Oscar would choose the opposite. Oscar was a chosen undead in their own right, and the two of you were destined to fight, to reveal the true chosen undead. But was this destiny, or just a cleverly orchestrated plan? Plan to the second, by Frampt and Karth, to find the true undead that's worthy of their Age of Dark title. Vati Vidya noticed some serpents on the doorway of the Church of Ariandel. These two serpents could represent Karth and Frampt, which could suggest that they are different snakes. But this depiction doesn't necessarily have to relate to the primordial serpents. They could be a double-headed serpent with unconsolable differences, each tugging the other towards their own goal. Double-headed serpents feature strongly in Aztec mythology and religion. In Nahuatl, the word coat can mean both snake and twin. The true significance of the double-headed serpent sculpture has been lost in the annals of history, but it could have been a representation of the earth and the underworld, with each head representing one each. This could relate to Frampt being the earthly head, while Karth represents the depths of the underworld. Fast forward to the events of Dark Souls 3, we can find many statues of the primordial serpent sprinkled throughout the lands of Lothric, which implies that the serpents have interacted with many civilizations. It's thought that both Karth and Frampt are patiently keeping their ideologies alive until they find the right undead to bring about the Age of Dark. And this may have carried on through to Dark Souls 3. The Sable Church preaches salvation to the Hollows of Lothric, being led by three sisters, Lillian, Yuria, and Elfrida. The Black Set details that these three maidens were of a primordial serpent. And if Yuria is killed, she says,
Karth, I have failed thee.
Now the Japanese version of this better translates to Karth, your dying wish was unfulfilled, implying that Karth is no longer alive. But what this still means is that the Sable Church is pushed by Karth, potentially wishing the Age of Dark to transpire. We do find that Karth's following is much greater in Lothric. Countless pilgrims journey to the fabled Lothric castle for an unknown purpose. Strongly driven by their devotion, most perish during their journey. One pilgrim from Londor, Yol, is still alive, and reveals like the other pilgrims, he is awaiting his own death.
Somehow I failed to die as was ordained.
So these pilgrims could simply be travelling to the leaders of Lothric, to send a message that their kingdom, along with their Age of Fire, is going to end. Perhaps in a similar vein to how Aldrich's Age of the Deep Sea is inevitable. Each of these pilgrims have chains and a shell that seem to bind and contain them. The cleric set explains that they bore large covers on their backs to ensure that they would not become seedbeds for spreading darkness. So it seems that these shells are preventing the pilgrims from spreading darkness, perhaps the pus of man, which is the corruption of the abyss. On the high wall of Lothric, we see hollows in the process of transforming into trees. And strangely, all of these hollows are facing the Lothric castle. So these hollows could have been pilgrims, but perhaps they're in the process of becoming seedbeds and spreading darkness. We can in fact see branches escaping out of Yol and other pilgrim shells. So perhaps this is a seedbed trying to take control, but the shell prevents it. The pilgrim butterflies are an enemy that hint at resemblance to the pilgrims of Londor, and they themselves can also be found at the peak of Lothric as well. If we examine these butterflies closely, they seem to be made of flesh and bone, with a ribcage jutting outward, a strange kind of composition for a butterfly. They also seem to be resembling the tree transforming hollows. Zay suggests that these pilgrims actually evolved from their shell-like states through to a pilgrim butterfly. Could this be why the pilgrims are sacrificing themselves, in the hope that they burst forth as a pilgrim butterfly? The -110 theorises that the pilgrim's initial death is actually some kind of metamorphosis, cocooning in their ready-made shells and emerging as a butterfly. In the Cathedral of the Deep, there are a collection of statues depicting a cocooned being sprouting wings, perhaps being a pilgrim. This transformation into an angelic form could parallel the transformation of a pilgrim into a pilgrim butterfly. The Dragonslayer armour guards the entrance to the Grand Archives in Lothric Castle, but it lost its master long ago, and is now controlled by the pilgrim butterflies. Lord Status 7 suggests that the pilgrim butterflies are attempting to prevent the unkindled ash from linking the flame, due to the ties with Darkstalker Carr. But why are all of these pilgrims chained, presumably like the clerics, to prevent the spreading of the pus of man, the abyss? If they want to prevent the Age of Fire, why would they be trying to contain the darkness? Cumulomenrod proposes a more matured idea that the pilgrims may have not been actually preventing the mana pus from spreading, but rather germinating it inside them, and when they arrive at Lothric, the mature pus of man blossoms them into the pilgrim butterflies. This germinating could be similar to the primordial serpent Carr, who patiently waits for the right time of the Age of Dark. As for the hollow trees, they could be those that don't fully understand the pus of man, like the pilgrims, and prematurely allow the pus to take over their bodies, turning them into the failed butterflies that are the trees. But there is one individual that has been conveniently left out of this theory. The stone-humped hag looks the same as the Londor pilgrims, but strangely, when she dies, an angel appears.
My time has come, has it? Well, maybe I'll get to see an angel.
Could it be, like Sundown Kid hypothesises, that the pilgrim's ultimate goal is actually to turn into an angel, tying to the angelic faith of Dark Souls 3? Maybe the angels are just part of the transformation, either before or after the pilgrim butterflies. The pilgrims could be under the illusion that they are following the path of an angel, but have actually been tricked by Carr, hastening the spread of darkness. And this might not be the only instance where Carth has tricked a town. Marvellous Chester states that Ulasil brought the abyss upon themselves, spreading the darkness.
Fooled by that toothy serpent, they upturned the grave of primeval man and incited his ornery wrath. What could they have been thinking?
A toothy serpent definitely sounds like the primordial serpent, and the outcome seems to be the same, the spreading of darkness. The town of Ulasil uncovered the grave of Manus, the father of the abyss. Manus sent the inhabitants of Ulasil mad, swallowing everything in his wake with the darkening of the abyss. The furtive pygmy was one of the original four lords.
They came and found the souls of lords within the flame. Nito, the first of the dead, the witch of Izalith, and her daughters of chaos, Gwyn, the lord of sunlight, and his faithful knights. the furtive pygmy, so easily forgotten.
After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the 3 souls, but your progenitor found a 4th, unique soul, the Dark Soul.
The furtive pygmies foresaw the Age of Dark and created humans from the darkness. Such an important character, but no one knows the true identity of the furtive pygmy. One theory is that Manus is the furtive pygmy. Manus is described as being a primeval human, meaning of the earliest time in human history. So Manus could indeed be the first human, and being such a powerful individual, it makes sense that the power of the Abyss could be a result of Manus fighting the Dark Soul, becoming mad, and spreading its power. But while Carve describes the furtive pygmy's soul as unique, the soul of Manus is described as an extraordinary soul, so it doesn't seem that likely that Manus is the furtive pygmy. The Ashen Hollow suggests that perhaps Velka is actually the furtive pygmy. The Vow of Silence is a miracle in Dark Souls that is the secret rite of the black-haired witch Velka, having a great range of influence even as the gods are concerned. In Dark Souls 3, the Vow of Silence is now a miracle of the Sable Church of Londor. The Sable Church's decree is to usurp, permanently remove the first flame. In Dark Souls 2, Uldir describes the first sin as Gwyn linking the first flame. Now, Velka is the goddess of sin, deciding what actions are sinful or not. It would make sense that for an individual heavily affiliated with the dark, the lighting of the flame would be considered a sin. So maybe Velka is the receiver of the Dark Soul, the furtive pygmy. I don't think this is that likely, as Miyazaki states in the Game no Shokotaku interview that the furtive pygmy is male. And if we cast our minds back to the Dark Souls 1 introduction of the furtive pygmy, they do state the pygmy is so easily forgotten. Individuals such as Manus and Velka are quite memorable throughout Dark Souls, so perhaps, like the narrator suggests, the real furtive pygmy is somewhat easily missable in the Dark Souls universe. Come the release of the Dark Souls 3 Ring City DLC, the narrative of the true form of the pygmy continues. The final area of the Ring City lies an area barren and sprinkled with ruins. Within these ruins are 8 thrones, 8 places to seek the pygmy kings. Draxanelli found 7 corpses of pygmies that can be found throughout the ruins, with an 8 pygmy king having been the last survivor, crawling his way to Gwyn's daughter Filianor. But while there are 8 pygmy kings, the Dark Souls cinematic only mentions a single pygmy being the furtive pygmy. A statue can be found in the Ring City that seemingly immortalises Gwyn crowning a single pygmy. Perhaps these individually shown pygmies are one and the same, and there is in fact a single pygmy, the true furtive pygmy, apart from the 8 other pygmy kings. Draxanelli does note that where the 8 thrones can be found in the Ring City, there is a gap for a central 9th throne to have taken place, but this has seemingly been removed, easily forgotten. So who could have been this furtive pygmy, the 9th pygmy king? Perhaps there's evidence of this lost and forgotten pygmy still within the Ring City. One hollow found within the Ring City has lost their memory and cannot remember their real name, so goes by the name Lap. Lap in Swedish and Norwegian translates to patch, and you can gain the patch's squat gesture from Lap. So it seems that Lap is a persona of Patches, and King Sham is just that he is in fact the true furtive pygmy. An individual that's so easily forgotten has in fact forgotten themselves, and returned to a place of utmost importance to them.
Every age, it seems, is tainted by the greed of men. Rubbish to one such as I, devoid of all worldly wants. I don't know. Maybe it's just the way we are. I'll stick you in my prayers. A fine dark soul to you.
Patches throughout the Dark Souls universe is secretive, guiltily slinking around the areas we encounter him, such as the Tomb of the Giants in Dark Souls 1. This fits the meaning of furtive, which is attempting to avoid notice and attention. Unbreakable Patches in Dark Souls 3 seems to not have lost his humanity since we encountered him in Dark Souls 1, and is one of the few to have not gone hollow. Perhaps a strong soul, such as the Dark Soul, kept them from hollowing. However, Patches does seem more likely to be a recurring mascot through the Soul series. but perhaps this dismissive thought is actually what makes him the most easily forgotten of characters. Draxanelli emphasises this so easily forgotten message of the narrator, and brings to light the presence of a character that we are introduced to at the start of the Ring City. An individual who looks like a pygmy in resemblance, and indeed has the same voice actor. This Hollow despises the god.
To curse the gods and bring ruin upon this accursed heap of dung.
This could relate to the actions of a furtive pygmy. So could the long easily forgotten but important furtive pygmy be the easily forgotten and mysterious Ring City Hollow? Whoever the furtive pygmy is, they made a profound impact upon the world of Dark Souls, albeit for better or for worse. Nothing else seems to be present in all 3 Dark Souls games. Was that statement really correct? Let's plunge into the Abyss layer for a deeper look. One character who seems to be leaving traces of themselves throughout Lordran, Drangleic and Lothric is Dragonslayer Ornstein. Part of the Four Knights, along with Hawkeye Goth, Chiron, the Lord's Blade, and Artorias, the Abyss Walker, they were Lord Gwyn's most accomplished warriors, with Ornstein believed to be the captain of this mighty crew. In Lordran, Ornstein is found guarding the cathedral in Analondo, along with Executioner Smo, protecting both it and Guinevere, the daughter of Gwyn, and the Princess of Sunlight. Ultimately, both these heroic guards are defeated by the Chosen Undead. But Ornstein's Dragonslayer set in Dark Souls 3 states that Ornstein, who long guarded the ruined cathedral, left the land in search of the Nameless King. How could this be? Didn't the Chosen Undead kill Ornstein? There is one theory that could explain this, and that is that Ornstein actually never physically met the Chosen Undead. The Ornstein that was posting guard at the cathedral was just an illusion. During the battle with Ornstein and Smo, one of the characters dies before the other, with the sole surviving member consuming the power of the other. When both Ornstein and Smo have been laid to rest, only one soul is dropped. Now, depending on who we fight first, this could either be the soul of Ornstein or the soul of Smo. So which one dropping is the true canon event of Dark Souls? Also found in the land of Lothric is Smo's hammer and armour, which states that he was the last knight to remain at his post, guarding the ruined cathedral. So if Smo was the last knight to remain at the post, that would mean that Ornstein either died first in battle, or was always an illusion, with the real Ornstein adventuring to find the Nameless King. And if Ornstein was to die first, then the only soul we do see is the soul of Smo. But could Smo really become more powerful after absorbing an illusion? And why would Ornstein's illusion require many hits to dissipate, while other illusions like Guinevere's disappear after a single hit? Well, Gwendolyn himself has made many enemies that are actually just an illusion, and these enemies are just as menacing as their non-illusional counterparts. But 100 Flies suggests that the Ornstein illusion could be enhanced by a soul fragment from the original Ornstein. Seath, known for his obsessive experiments and research, created the Moonlight Butterfly, with its soul being its very own creation. In a similar way, Gwendolyn could have potentially used a piece of Ornstein's soul to create a more powerful illusion of Ornstein while he was away from the cathedral. But Ornstein being an illusion is quite theoretical, with there being no concrete evidence that Ornstein was actually one. Perhaps, like Wit5683 suggests, Ornstein was somehow revived or resurrected while the flame was linked. Or Dark Souls 3 is in some sort of convoluted timeline that only slightly parallels the events of Dark Souls 1. But the presence of this recurring Dragonslayer doesn't just stop there. In the land of Drangleic, we can find an old Dragonslayer defending the Cathedral of Blue. The soul of the old Dragonslayer states that they are reminiscent of a certain knight that appears in old legends. It sounds strangely familiar. But why would they be protecting the Cathedral of Blue of all places? Both this old Dragonslayer and Ornstein have a similar look and a similar combat style, with both protecting cathedrals. There are two main theories as to whom the old Dragonslayer is. He could in fact be Dragonslayer Ornstein, or someone who has just been inspired by Ornstein. Ornstein was originally tasked with protecting the Princess Guinevere, who was also an illusion, having left Analondo long ago. The Ring of the Sun Princess in Dark Souls 3 states that after leaving Analondo, Guinevere marries Flann, the god of flame. The Cathedral of Blue is in Hades, which has a tower of flame, Save Point speculates that Hades was built by Guinevere and Flann, due to it looking quite similar to Anor Londo, and Ornstein then followed them to Hades. However, the Dragon Slayer here utilises dark elemental attacks, while Ornstein used lightning attacks, juxtaposing light and dark. Save Point suggests that as time went on, Ornstein lost track of Guinevere, his purpose in life, and darkness slowly took over. Aratharion speculates that Ornstein actually fought against Nashandra in order to allow Guinevere to flee, and this is what caused him to succumb to the darkness. This could be supported by the clear battle scars throughout Hades. Maybe this long-lost battle included Ornstein. Interestingly, both souls dropped by these bosses in Dark Souls 1 and Dark Souls 2 are used to create the same Dragon Slayer's spear, with both of them being lightning based, even though the old Dragon Slayer uses dark elemental attacks. On the other hand, some argue that the Dragon Slayer is not Ornstein, but someone who just idolised him. The similarities between Ornstein and Dragon Slayer are that of an imitator, with the duties of guarding a cathedral to the armour that they are wearing. But their element of choice is indeed different, and this could infer that the origin of this being is from a different past to Ornstein. Because of Ornstein's soul being dropped after their defeat in the original Dark Souls, D-Boy97 theorises that the old Dragon Slayer is an imposter, with the true identity of this warrior being the shieldless Lathian. The Dragon Slayer's crest axe describes it as the axe of a gallant shieldless Lathian, the only Dragon Slayer actually mentioned in Dark Souls 2. He abruptly retired from the battlefield and was never heard from again, with some speculating that he went to slay the legendary dragon. This axe also has similar lightning properties to Ornstein's spear, but Lathian is never seen in the world of Drangleic. Is this because he himself is the old Dragon Slayer? Perhaps during the battle, when Lathian was growing tired, he learnt of the Nameless King and his knight Ornstein. Inspired by Ornstein, he built an area similar to what Anor Londo would have been like, and imitated his idol, slaying dragons. As for the old Leo ring found in the old Dragon Slayer, which seems to be a worn version of Ornstein's Leo ring, this could be explained in a similar fashion to Havel's rings. All the knights that wore Havel's rings were not Havel, so perhaps many Dragon Slayers, maybe some under Ornstein, wore the Leo ring. If the old Dragon Slayer is indeed an imitation of the tales of the mighty Dragon Slayer Ornstein, the individual could have been anyone, but Lathian is the most lore to support the role. Ayokreshi7480 believes that the old Dragon Slayer could simply just be a Silver Knight, who greatly admired Ornstein, copying his looks and movesets out of admiration. Because Ornstein left Anor Londo to find the Nameless King, the Silver Knight also left Anor Londo to find him. But tragically, he succumbed to the abyss along his journey, turning his armour black, and turning his attacks to dark elemental. Perhaps this could explain how Ornstein's armour made it all the way to Archdragon Peak, near the Nameless King, the one he was searching for. Ornstein, being the old Dragon Slayer, presumes that Guinevere left Anor Londo to Hades, and indeed no one knows for sure where exactly Guinevere ventured to. Tosman Dunn believes that Rosaria, the Mother of Rebirth, found in the Cathedral of the Deep, could in fact be Guinevere. Confined behind iron bars and resting on her bed, Rosaria, Mother of Rebirth, is an unkept cloud of mystery. Even though Rosaria is unable to speak, she formed a covenant with her fingers, those who hunt for tongues on her behalf. Rosaria's soul can be transposed into the miracle Bountiful Sunlight, a special miracle granted by the Princess of Sunlight, Guinevere, the loved mother and wife who bestowed their blessing onto many. Rosaria is the Mother of Rebirth, while Guinevere is also seen as a motherly figure, so her core motherly values could have remained throughout time. One of Rosaria's fingers is the ring finger Leonard, a masked man who can be found at the Firelink Shrine. His mask covers the scars of deep burns, a scolding which he received in his youth. He sought the Mother of Rebirth so that he could be healed and reborn. But after becoming a finger of Rosaria, he abstained from healing his injuries, and instead chose to serve the goddess as her knight. But as the story progresses, Leonard kills Rosaria, essentially ending the life of the one he swore to protect. But why would he do such a thing? If we invade Leonard, we can find him in Anor Londo with Rosaria's soul.
Well, back for more, are you? Vicious one, aren't you? I knew it all along. And now you want to ravage her soul as well.
One theory, which Blue Manor Worm agrees with, is that Leonard is actually crazy and obsessive over Rosaria. Leonard wants to protect Rosaria and sees the offerings made by the Ashen One and others as a threat to his closeness with Rosaria, wanting all of her adoration for himself, so he takes her soul all for himself. Or perhaps more likely, Leonard sees the other fingers as abusing his beloved Rosaria, hurting and exploiting her for their own gain.
And now you want to ravage her soul as well.
This implies, according to Leonard, that something else of Rosaria has been ravaged. Maybe this was her body, being abused for rebirth. So in Leonard's reality, he may be thinking that he's protecting Rosaria. Leonard is in Analondo, Guinevere's chambers, and this could be to reform the Princess of Sunlight using the soul of Rosaria, with Rosaria actually being Guinevere. However, a lot of these parallels could simply be due to Rosaria and Gertrude just being related, thus closely linked. But Funky Koi Fish proposes another theory, that Rosaria is in fact Gertrude, the heavenly daughter of Guinevere. The miracle Bountiful Sunlight is in fact a more powerful version of Bountiful Light, a miracle that's taught to knights by Gertrude. So it's possible that Gertrude herself had a more powerful version of the miracle she taught, having received the miracle from her mother. The Divine Pillars of Light details that Gertrude is mute, while the Pale Tongue denies Rosaria herself as being mute. Gertrude was held prisoner in the Grand Archives, and there are some similarities when observing the bars in Gertrude's cage and Rosaria's chambers. Man grubs can also be found around both locations. But also in Gertrude's cage is a corpse. Dark Souls tells many stories with the placement of bodies, so it's strong reasoning to believe that Gertrude in fact perished in her cell. But the doors to the cell are opened, so perhaps Gertrude did manage to escape, making her way to the Cathedral of the Deep, and adopting the role of the Mother of Rebirth, with perhaps a fallen soldier appearing as a corpse in Gertrude's cage instead. However, a lot of these parallels could simply be due to Rosaria and Gertrude being related, thus closely linked. I'll See You on the Dark Side of the 6307 points out that while Gertrude became blinded and muted due to a visit from an angel, the obscuring ring alludes that Rosaria, the Mother of Rebirth, was robbed of her tongue by her firstborn, and had been waiting for its return ever since. Tossman Dunn counted that the man grub found next to Gertrude's cage could actually be a result of Rosaria, who if was Guinevere, sent a man grub to see her daughter. And perhaps the man grub that Rosaria so obsessively clutches in her bed could be a rebirth of Gertrude. Bob the Hollow proposes that Rosaria is neither Guinevere nor Gertrude, but is actually Guinevere's mother. Rosaria was robbed of her tongue by her firstborn. If she was indeed Guinevere's mother, Gwyn's husband, then the Nameless King would have been her firstborn. The Nameless King was stripped of his stature as punishment for his foolishness. Possibly the Nameless King was exiled for siding with the dragons, but perhaps he only sided with the dragons after he was exiled. Bob suggests that Rosaria is actually affiliated with the Dark. Her covenant, Rosaria's Fingers, encourages Red Orb invaders, offering tongues as prize to their speechless goddess. Perhaps the Nameless King became aware of Rosaria's darkness, and how disturbed it was, striking her down, trying to convince his family of Rosaria's cruelty. An interesting theory that would offer a lot more closure to the Nameless King and his mother. I do like the subtle links between the two. Rosaria, one who cannot speak, has tongues being offered to her in her name. And the son, the king, who took Rosaria's speech, as punishment, had his name removed, so no one can speak about him. This kind of thought process makes me believe that if Rosaria was Guinevere's mother, he did indeed take her tongue. For what reason, we cannot be sure. But for the punishment to fit the crime, something that must be spoken was also taken from him, and that was his name. Many people explain away these complex twisted narratives, such as the summoning of NPC characters, even after they have died, by explaining that the means of time is convoluted. Solera of Astora, a knight who willingly became undead in the land of Lodrin, so that he could search for his own son, states that
the flow of time itself is convoluted, with heroes centuries old phasing in and out.
But Loki actually points out that the original translation for time is not that it's convoluted, but rather that it's stagnant. Stagnant time could suggest that the cycle repeats in the same world, over and over again, which would explain why enemies respawn when sitting at bonfires. But as Chakado8993 points out, convoluted means to have a complicated structure and therefore difficult to understand. And I think because we are even discussing time in this sort of manner to begin with, we should already know that it's going to be complicated. Solaire himself is a complicated individual that's clouded in mystery. Solaire's armour set is of high quality, but lacked any particular powers. Solaire's incredible prowess must have come from rigorous training alone, for his equipment exhibits no special traits. Such a likeable and famous individual in Lordran, at least from the fanbase, Solaire has been a constant fuel of speculation as he paints a larger picture than has been revealed. One more common theory presented by the attendee is that Solaire is actually the Carthus sandworm. Solaire is desperately looking for a light source.
I did not find my own son, not in Anor Londo, nor in Twilight Blighttown. Where else might my son be? Lost Izalith? Or the tomb of the Grave Lord?
And it's in Lost Izalith that Solaire indeed finds his light source, but it's that of a sunlight maggot, which is attached to his face. The maggot's description reads, a loathsome parasite that inhabits Lost Izalith, is completely immobile, yet still lives. The attendee hypothesises that the maggot shares its powers with its hosts, in order to keep both of them alive, as the parasite needs a living host. This maggot, over many years, has transformed itself in Solaire into a giant sandworm known as the Carthus sandworm. The Carthus sandworm can be found in the Demon Ruins in Dark Souls 3. And in Dark Souls 1, the Demon Ruins is right next to Izalith, so it wouldn't have been far for the maggot-turned-sandworm to move. Solaire's Armour of the Sunset can also be found in Lordran, dropped by Snuggly the Crow, and with no sign of its original owner. When defeated, the Carthus sandworm also drops the Undead Bone Shard, a bone of the undead. Maybe this undead is Solaire, or could it just be presenting the grotesque nature of the Carthus sandworm? But Fire Akasha does pretty much condemn this theory to fantasy. The Yellow Bug Pellet states that Grave Wardens of Carthus used these to propel a great sandworm. The worm tumbled into the catacombs and proceeded to dominate its new home in the Smouldering Lake. So it seems like the sandworm actually originated from the catacombs of Carthus, which means that it being Solaire is less likely. Lord Bood suggests that Solaire is Gwyn's firstborn, who in turn was the Nameless King like we previously stated. Bude believes it's no coincidence that the Sunlight Maggot helm found on Solaire is a similar style to the crown of the Great Lord, Lord Gwyn. Solaire and the Nameless King also have affiliation with lightning, with Solaire using the lightning spear, a miracle passed down to be bound by the warrior of the Sunlight Covenant. But this kind of loose lightning affiliation could also be used to link Solaire to enemies like the Carthus sandworm, with the sandworm dropping the lightning stake, which details that lightning should not be held as a bolt, but rather thrust as a stake to be truly effective against dragons. However, this is not the only similarity. Solaire wears the iron bracelet, said to be the bracelet of a Knight of Sunlight from a previous age. The Nameless King wears golden bracelets, which are said to closely resemble those of the First Lord. Bracelets are a rare armour in Dark Souls, the only others to have worn bracelets are Gwyn himself, with the bracelet of the Great Lord, and of course High Lord Wolnir, who wore 3 golden bracelets. Wolnir's holy sword states that he stripped the 3 armlets from the corpses of clerics. Clerics are members of the Way of White, followers of the Great Lord Gwyn. So it seems bracelets have some sort of connection with the Great Lord Gwyn. Where the Nameless King resides, the Archdragon Peak, the sky is unusually sunny. Perhaps this is the sun that Solaire was looking for. Ultimately though, I don't think either theory for as to who Solaire could be is that likely. Miyazaki explained in the Japanese podcast Jamnu Shokataku that if he successfully kills the Sunlight Maggots before he attaches himself to Solaire, he will return to his own world and link the flame. Although he did state that it was expected that Solaire would be taken over by the Sunlight Maggot. So maybe this does leave some wiggle room for these theories to take flight. I can't help but like the fun theory raised by Soul XDD, where he states that Solaire has been turned into a chef, which is why in Lothric you can see an unusually high amount of sunlight metals near Esther's soups. Patrick Leander 8872 points out that Solaire definitely didn't make any of the soups, as Sigurd of Katarina has.
I know. Won't you join me for dinner? I make a fine Esther soup. I've got some stewing right now.
But maybe he was inspired by a mutual friend of ours.
Long may the sun shine.
But truly the main reason that these theories are ever flowing is due to the murking conclusion of Solaire's life. It's definitely possible to save Solaire, as his future remains unclear, left for players to surmise. This kind of mystery can also be found all the way back in the Undead Berg. We can find an undead merchant here who sells loot that he has taken from the corpses of other fallen adventurers. Maybe he's hollowing because he keeps on mentioning someone who he thinks is next to him.
Oh, this one. Ain't she lovely? Her name is Yulia. She's plumb in love with me. You'd never leave my side now, would you, Yulia?
Who is this Yulia? Almost like a companion that the undead merchant is mentioning, all the while stroking a broken barrel that's next to him. One theory is that Yulia is actually the female undead merchant that you find in the sewers between Firelink and the Undead Berg. Maybe she was originally trapped in the now broken barrel next to the undead merchant, but somehow she managed to escape. Maybe this is what the male merchant is alluding to when he says,
You'd never leave my side now, would you, Yulia?
This could be a threat, or even just being in denial that Yulia did in fact run away from him. Or maybe it's just evidence that this undead merchant is absolutely insane. Barrels do seem to ring a bell. Haven't we already talked about barrels before? Well, yes indeed we have, all the way back to our friend Griggs, who was first found in a room full of barrels. This room is initially locked, and for the chosen undead to enter this room, they require the residence key. Any guesses where we can obtain this residence key from? You guessed it, the undead merchant. It seems that this merchant is obsessed with barrels. So for us to fully uncover this mystery, let's become obsessed ourselves, and warp ourselves to the barrel layer of the iceberg. As we said before, inside all of these barrels in the Undead Berg residence, there is a dead merchant. Could this be evidence of old habits dying hard for the habitual body stuffer that's the male merchant? McCool Tracks 5 believes that Yulia could in fact be a butcher from the depths. When the chosen undead first encounter the butchers, they find that they are busily preparing lunch for those of the depths. Nearby we can find another group of barrels in a room, with Laurentius of the Great Swamp trapped inside one of the barrels.
Thank you. I would have been at supper without you. Been eaten alive. I shudder to think.
This statement by Laurentius actually led many to believe that the butchers were in fact female. But the butchers butcher their meat and don't eat it. Behind the first butcher's preparing table is a chute, which seems to be what the butchers would be feeding. At the bottom of the chute is a giant rat. This could mean that Laurentius is referring to the rat as the one eating him alive. But yet again, these rats wouldn't technically be eating Laurentius alive if he was being butchered by the butchers. Garian Wursig 7960 thinks that Laurentius was actually referring to Maneater Mildred as the one trying to devour Laurentius. But the only links to this is that Mildred herself is very similar to the butchers, and her name does suggest she likes eating men, so maybe she had a taste for a bit of Laurentius. In any case, butchers are still female, as Miyazaki has stated that the enemy cooks are ladies too, although this could still be a misunderstanding. Well, we've gotten ourselves slightly distracted there, talking about MK Ultrax 5's point. So we know that butchers have barrels filled with people to perhaps slaughter, and there's a similar room of barrels in the Undead Berg that the Undead Merchant has access to. So perhaps there's a link between these two unlikely friends. Yulia could have been a butcher herself, or maybe a future meal for the butchers to prepare. I think Yulia is much more likely to be a pet of some sort though. One popular theory is that Yulia is actually the Undead Merchant's sword, Uchikatana. The sword is dropped by the Undead Merchant, and upon his death, he cries,
Little Yulia. Oh.
So this could be a reference to his sword. The Undead Merchant strokes around the same height as the size of what a dog would be, and you wouldn't usually pass a sharp sword. He does warn the chosen undead.
Careful, she'll bite your little fingers off.
This would suggest that Yulia was a dog of some sort. Yo Am I and Pinko 4372 suggest that maybe Yulia ran away and got stuck in Blighttown. a giant water wheel overshadowing the shanty town of Blighttown. This wheel seems to spin because of a single flaming attack dog. Could this be Yulia? Well, not likely. The book Dark Souls Trilogy, Archive of the Fire, contained unique information provided by editorial department staff. And with that naming, it sounds like they know what they're talking about. They state that sitting next to the undead male merchant was Yulia, whom he pets gently and often. However, outside of his own eyes, this Yulia does not appear. So it seems more likely that Yulia is just the undead merchant being insane. That's just a barrel, you dingus. As for the Blighttown wheel, that actually isn't powered by the dog either. Illusory Wall managed to break through the invisible wall surrounding the water wheel and ended the dog's perpetual suffering. But yet, the wheel keeps turning on its own. Now before we tie off this iceberg expedition, there is one last layer we need to uncover. One giant layer, having been buried in the tombs below Lordran, and may even have connections to the Ash Lake. So let's go back to the beginning and explore the Ash Lake. Just past the catacombs lies the Tomb of the Giants, where both their inhabitants and their tombs are gigantuous. The entrance to the Tomb of the Giants is the arena for the necromancer Pinwheel, who utilises it as his chamber for experiments. Shonji Okori and Jao point out that Pinwheel's boss room is actually a giant coffin, like many of the other larger tombs scattered around. So who could have been buried in these tombs? Bosses like the Ceaseless Discharge are terrifyingly large, but this is most likely due to his transformation by the Flame of Chaos. The Cemetery of Ash in Lothric also contains a giant coffin. Some theorise that this coffin could have been a casket for Aldrich, but Henri of Astora states that his coffin was in the Cathedral of the Deep.
We reached the Cathedral of the Deep, but Aldrich's coffin was empty.
Others theorise the tomb was actually Yhorm the Giant's, with the tomb somehow making its way from the Tomb of the Giants to the Cemetery of Ash. But there is a large difference in location between the Tomb of the Giants to the Cemetery of Ash, which means that Yhorm's coffin in Lothric is not that likely to have been seen at the Tomb of the Giants. It's been rumoured that Yhorm the Giant was actually meant to be the tutorial boss, so maybe his tomb was just left behind there. Either way, the tomb at the Tomb of the Giants is currently home to the tragic Pinwheel. Pinwheel is a character that has been dissected by countless theorists, including Illusory Wall, with many stating that Pinwheel is the admirer of Gravelord Nito, and to a degree obsesses over him. Gravelord Nito we have mentioned briefly as just being the first of the dead, whose cloak is stuffed full of corpses of those who have died. When we encounter Pinwheel, he's working on a skeleton, lying down with a long curved blade attached in the place of its right hand, almost as if Pinwheel was trying to recreate Nito. And this might not be the first time that Pinwheel has tried to recreate something before. Many suggest that Pinwheel's theme song is a fusion of three people, with them being represented by different whispers. Concept art of Pinwheel displays himself as an amalgamation of three members. Some speculate that this is drawn over an official art book drawing, but further evidence is through Pinwheel's Japanese name, Sanin Hayori, which translates to the three-person coat or three-person weave. And maybe like Pinwheel, Nito himself was once three different entities, and he himself amalgamated, only leaving the other coffins behind. Found with Nito, next to the massive coffin he climbs out of, is an empty coffin beside him, but there's also a third, smaller, unseen coffin further behind. Because of Pinwheel's obsession, along with the symbolism of three, some speculate that he's tied up with those three coffins. Upon death, Pinwheel drops the rite of kindling. Rhea, along with Vince and Nico, faithfully venture towards Nito, with Griggs explaining the reason as to why.
Did you see them? The three young clerics headed for the catacombs to seek kindling. Kindling is the art of feeding bonfires. The poor young girl sent down into a tomb. What a terrible mission she is burdened with.
It seems that the clerics were headed towards the Gravelord to go to the supposed place of the rite of kindling, but for some reason it's been stolen by Pinwheel. Maybe this is another layer upon his crazy obsession. Unbound King suggests that Pinwheel was initially a member of Nito's Gravelord Covenant. Through his initiation, he had to sever his trio, his wife and child, like Nito had to, which is what his graves represent. But Pinwheel would grow to regret his decision, and rebelled. He stole the right of kindling and fled from Nito's domain. The father desperately attempted to resurrect his wife and child, but in his attempt, created the abomination that is the Pinwheel. Now in his new form, Pinwheel spends his life studying and experimenting, drastically searching for a way to separate himself from his wife and child, but tragically can only create clones of himself. To provide some light after this dark, dark tale, there's a glimmer of light we can see in the Tomb of the Giants. The tranquil background of the Ash Lake shines its glory onto those brave enough to venture, deep, deep underground. The Ash Lake not only contains a stone dragon, but enormous trees, known as the Archtrees, littering the open expanse, along with one large skull, which origin is unknown. Illusory walls suggest that perhaps this giant skull is that of a giant coming from the Tomb of the Giants and tumbled down to the Ash Lake, washing up onto the Ash Lake shore. Renowned theorist Hawkshaw supposes that the skull is actually that of the nameless blacksmith deity. The Titanite chunk contains the rune I was, coming from a word for you. The Anglo-Saxon rune poem says, "You is a tree with rough bark, hard and fast in the earth, supported by its roots. A guardian of flame and a joy on native land." With countless more evidence, Hawkshaw theorised that the blacksmith harvested these Titanite chunks from the arch trees, as these are the trees that are holding up the world of Dark Souls. While it's certainly possible, and Hawkshaw has put a lot of effort into this theory, I do think that Hawkshaw has definitely jumped into the realm of overthinking. I'd say it's more so just mythological ties with Yggdrasil, the World Tree, which we see in one of Dark Souls' inspirations, Berserk, along with From Software's future work Elden Ring. In fact, many believe that each giant tree in the Ash Lake is a portal to a world of their own. One great hollow tree that the Chosen Undead can access goes from Ash Lake up to Blighttown, while another stretches from Lost Isolith to behind the Firelink Shrine. One more amusing theory is that other than crows, these trees could be a way some NPCs travel around the world of Lodron, with the Ash Lake being a travel station for all of these worlds. But there's one tree in Ash Lake that's not like the others. Instead of standing tall like the rest, this one has been felled, but doesn't appear to be rotten. In fact, it looks like it's seemingly been snapped in half. Boletaria is the land in Demon Souls, and there are countless theories that Dark Souls and Demon Souls are linked, with many references being highlighted between the two. But these connections don't have that much of a foothold. Demon Souls is a PlayStation exclusive, whereas Dark Souls was not, so it'd be very hard to mix the lore of an exclusive game with one that was not. The world Boletaria is essentially cut off from Dark Souls, so maybe this tree could be symbolism, being snapped, cutting off its world. Another theory proposed by Dustpea suggests that these giants actually turned into the Archtrees. The seed of a tree of giants proposed that when the giants fell, they grew into great trees. Death is not the end, for anything that has once ever lived remains a part of a great cycle of regeneration. So all the giants that were seemingly supposed to be buried in the tombs of the giants could have made their way down to the Ash Lake, transforming themselves into the large trees. During the Age of the Ancients, when humans and other creatures had not made impressions on the world was ruled by everlasting dragons and archtrees. The more commonly known theory, suggested by Dustpea, is that the ancient giants are actually populated by the souls of the everlasting dragon. Olvia, scholar of the First Sin, was attempting to recreate the ancient dragons, but as we discovered earlier, this was made using giant souls. Great King Vendrick of Drangleic once crossed the oceans to combat the giants, pillaging their land, and then brought back an unspecified prize. The giants, intent on revenge, crossed the sea to the lands of Drangleic, laying siege onto the Drangleic castle. When the bearer of the curse traverses the land of Drangleic, only a few giants remain. And these giants are quite ghastly looking, almost as if they are turning into trees, but they also have a large gaping hole taking up most of their face. However, if we venture into the memory of Jay, we can notice a burnt giant corpse. But this giant is different. It has a face, full of eyes and teeth. Was this corpse placed here on purpose, or was it just a development oversight? The making of Dark Souls 2 shows a development model of the giant, which seems to be quite similar to an enemy shown in the Despair release trailer. There's also concept art of giants, showing that they were originally meant to have faces. Changing the giant's appearance mid-development, while forgetting to change all the models of the giants, does seem like a possible reason. But could this be explained in the Dark Souls universe? Giants in the original Dark Souls seemingly had faces, and Yhorm the giant in Dark Souls 3 also has a face underneath his hood. So there are giants that have faces, while there are others that do not. Waylander 893 suggests that most of the giants that we see in Draenlang, including the one within Memories, are not actually giants, but golems who are harbouring giant souls. They propose that the kingdoms across the sea, where the giants had come from, were also suffering from the undead curse. But the giants managed to escape this curse by transferring their souls into bodies made of mud and stone, rendering themselves immortal. When they die, they become trees and drop seeds, continuing their great cycle of regeneration, being formed and returning to the earth's clay. So perhaps they transformed into the Archtrees, with their soul left to inhabit another vessel. This could have been done using the Ashen Mist Heart, which was the prize that Vendrick would later steal, managing to then create golems himself, having been experimenting to try and find a cure to the curse. One of the bosses in Draenlang, the Smelter Demon, has a similar absence of face to the giants, but is described as a massive iron that has been given a soul, much like a golem. Ashen Shroom suggests another theory, that the giants we see in Dark Souls 2 are the same species, but they're just hollowed versions. They've lost their faces in Dark Souls 2 because they're a curse, transitioning from the giants we see in Dark Souls 1 to their final hollow state of a tree, as we can see from their bark-like skin. Yhorm the giant also wears quite similar clothing to the Giant Lord, except that the Giant Lord is without a face, being hollow. In Dark Souls 3 we can also see hollows transforming into trees, meaning this transformation is not exclusive to giants. But then this leads us to a conundrum. If Yhorm is truly a giant like those in Dark Souls 2, why was he buried? Should he have not just turned to a tree when he died? There's a message in front of Yhorm's throne that reads, "Only a storm can fell a great wood." Now at first glance, this looks like a subtle hint at Yhorm's weakness. Maybe Great Wood is reference to the Great Yhorm becoming a tree of wood. Perhaps when Yhorm lit the fire, he broke the cycle of becoming a tree. Maybe it's only cursed giants that become giant trees, like the curse-rotted Great Wood in Dark Souls 3, being forced to have no end. There seems to be a strong correlation between giants and trees, so there's definitely reasoning behind the theory that the giants in Dark Souls 1 could have become the Archtrees. In Majula, there's an obelisk with a worn down wall on one side, stating that these letters are worn beyond recognition. But curiously, in the Portuguese version, the sign says the giants crossed the sea, perhaps to return home. What could this mean? Could returning home be a link into the cycle of regeneration that the giants are part of? Could it be a war memorial for the giants that have fought in the wall, with those that fell returning home? Dustby uses it to suppose that the giants were actually returning home to the form of a dragon. In the case of Shanalotte, remember how she stated she was born of dragons? Could it be that she was a result of the dragon experiments that Uldir was making on giants? But there's one point we missed in this theory. The seed of the Tree of Giants has one crucial line. But what of those outside the cycle? The ancient dragons are immortal, so the question posed by the seed of the Tree of Giants could be about the ancient dragons. Perhaps, like Eldgustone suggests, the other entity since the beginning, the Archtrees, are actually part of this cycle, and when the giants die, they are planted, patiently waiting for the Grey to return. Polo XGS and Death Sightsky propose an alternate theory with the premise that not only the giants, but everything is connected to the Archtrees. Giants in Dark Souls 2, the undead settlement in Dark Souls 3, the root-like shapes from the heart when hollowing occurs. It seems that when anyone hollows, they turn back into the seeds of a new life. Essentially, we're all Groot. One of the first Archtrees that you come across in Dark Souls 1 is titled the Great Hollow. Now this is physically a hollowed out tree, but what if it's actually implying the hollowing loss of humanity? Everyone is destined to grow into the Archtrees, but then there was fire. The first flame disrupted this process. Humans and fire appeared, but so did madness and the abyss. If the flame dies, would darkness reign supreme, with grey trees and grey water return? I prefer this theory, as I think there's a lot more evidence to suggest that there are many more things other than giants that are returning to become trees again. But perhaps giants are a special, superior case to this. As for the obelisk in Majula, Illusory Wall went through this on Tumblr in detail, stating that this text was appointed to new DLC locations. Every time a new DLC was launched, the obelisk would temporarily give riddles on where the new content was located. After the DLC had been out for a while, the text would later revert back to being worn beyond recognition. So what was with the message in the Portuguese version? The translators claimed that it was an error, and the Portuguese version was added in an early patch in the game, so perhaps they were testing the DLC messages during that time. But even if this was a test message, it has to be derived from something. So maybe there still is more lore attainable from this than just a simple development error. Development errors or not, Dark Souls have been providing us all with many fruitful hours, allowing our brains to ponder the many mysteries held within. Although not that likely, I always ponder what a Dark Souls 4 would be like. Perhaps one that Aldrich has predicted, with the coming age of the deep sea dominating the lands. Thank you for coming on this journey with me. Although this Iceberg is definitive, I don't keep my word, so don't be surprised if we go venturing back out again into Dark Souls. Let me know what you think about these theories in the comments below, and I hope to see you all again.